Chapter 4487. The Pan-God Emperor had naturally thought of the problem that Crimson Afterglow had raised. However, this was only one of her many thoughts. She still needed to return to the fleet and investigate before she could confirm her conjectures. Crimson Afterglow also understood this point. Everything she said now was just conjecture and could not be confirmed. What they needed to do was to remain vigilant against the Kongming Temple and quickly return to the fleet to comfort the 10,000 survivors. As for revenge, that could only be discussed later. Meanwhile, in the Kongming Temple's headquarters, the fourth palace master had gathered 2,000 elite godly monarchs and quietly left the Kongming mystic realm. They boarded a top-grade king-grade divine warship and concealed their tracks as they silently rushed towards Seven Moon Mountain. The fourth palace master's mission was to pacify Seven Moon Mountain and prevent the Pan-Rua fleet from retaliating. With the fourth palace master, the God Emperor, leading the team and 2,000 godly monarchs, it was definitely more than enough. Even if the Pan-God Emperor returned to the fleet, it would be easy for the fourth palace master to wipe out the 10,000 soldiers of the Pan-Rua fleet. The reason why so many godly monarchs were mobilized was because the fourth palace master still had other secret missions. In the minds of the palace masters, this matter was far from simple. They had to make ample preparations to prevent any accidents from happening. While the divine warship was rushing, the fourth palace master released his divine sense and used a secret technique to track down the Pan-God Emperor's location. Before setting off, the first palace master had instructed him to keep a close eye on the Pan-God Emperor. The fourth palace master naturally had to grasp the Pan-God Emperor's location and whereabouts, but he could not get too close. Otherwise he would be detected by the Pan-God Emperor. The Pan-God Emperor and the fourth palace master were both rushing towards Seven Moon Mountain. At this moment, Seven Moon Mountain was under lockdown and all the divine palaces were closed. The 180,000 citizens of Seven Moon Mountain who had hidden in the divine palaces had already retreated from the divine palaces and returned to the city. However, all the citizens received the news that Qinyu Hall had suffered a crushing defeat and suffered heavy casualties. Not only had the mainstays of Qinyu Hall suffered heavy casualties, but several elders and deacons had also lost their lives in the battle. It could be said that Qinyu Hall had suffered the most devastating blow and trauma in its history. It was currently at its weakest. This news made the citizens of Qinyu Hall feel depressed and uneasy. People were hiding in their own homes, but they couldn't help but secretly communicate with each other and discuss in whispers. The entire city was enveloped in an oppressive and gloomy atmosphere, filled with the smell of panic and uneasiness. The Hall Master of the Pure Moon Hall and the remaining 1,000 elite subjects all returned to their respective divine palaces to recuperate and heal their wounds. The Master of Qinyu Hall didn't want to explain the crushing defeat and heavy losses of Qinyu Hall. He also didn't have the extra energy to comfort the panicking people. All he could do was close the city's entrances and exits and activate the defensive formation. Furthermore, he sent out the godly kings and godly lords who hadn't participated in the battle and weren't injured to guard the vital points of the city. They also maintained vigilant patrols. The reason he did this was to prevent Hanya's fleet from counterattacking and ambushing them. Hanya's fleet had also suffered heavy losses, so the possibility of them attacking Seven Moon Mountain wasn't high. However, the master of Qinyu Hall had already suffered a loss. Of course, he had to maintain his vigilance and take precautions. On the other hand, the master of Qinyu Hall also wanted to prevent the citizens from panicking and escaping from the city. He had already reported the situation to the Kongming Temple. He believed that the Kongming Temple would soon send a temple master to resolve this matter. What he needed to do was wait patiently. He just needed to protect Seven Moon Mountain before a certain temple master arrived. Seven Moon Mountain was completely silent. No sound could be heard and no traces of the citizens could be seen. Only the patrolling guards could be seen in the sky. South of Seven Moon Mountain, in a mountain range 10 million li away, Hanya's fleet was resting. It was similarly silent. The remaining 50 warships stopped in the sky and arranged themselves in a circular formation. The divine power of the various divine warships was interconnected, forming a huge defensive barrier. All the warships maintained a defensive posture. The heavily injured soldiers were in seclusion and recuperating in the warships. The soldiers with lighter injuries who could still recover some of their combat strength after some simple treatment, acted as guards, maintaining vigilance and monitoring the surroundings. They were outsiders to the planet of origin. Currently, apart from Hanya God Emperor and Crimson Afterglow, everyone else could be an enemy. They couldn't guess what would happen next, so they could only prepare and defend, preventing any accidents from happening. Only when Hanya God Emperor returned could the soldiers relax their vigilance. Ji Tianxing had achieved his goal, but he didn't leave. He would often wander between Hanya's fleet and Seven Moon Mountain, observing the movements of both sides and speculating on the movements of the Kongming Temple and Hanya God Emperor. He was certain that Hanya God Emperor wouldn't join the Kongming Temple after receiving the news. Currently, Hanya God Emperor would definitely return to the fleet as quickly as possible. The Kongming Temple wasn't stupid or kind. They would most likely send 1 or 2 temple masters, leading many elite experts, to Seven Moon Mountain to deal with the aftermath. He didn't have any grudges with the Kongming Temple's temple masters, so he didn't have to provoke them. However, he needed to grasp Hanya God Emperor's movements and find a good opportunity to strike, defeating or killing Hanya God Emperor. Only by dealing with Hanya God Emperor as quickly as possible could he explore the planet of origin and search for the other 4 God Emperors. When the time came, he would adapt to the situation and use all sorts of methods to deal with the other 4 God Emperors one by one. And now he was wandering between Seven Moon Mountain and Hanya's fleet, waiting for Hanya God Emperor to pass by. He had already laid down several traps and ambushes on the path Hanya God Emperor would take to return to the fleet, waiting for them to come. He was keenly aware that when Hanya God Emperor went to the Kongming Temple, she had only brought Crimson Dawn and a squad of guards with her. Right now, Hanya God Emperor's defenses were at their weakest. Once she returned to the fleet, Ji Tianxing would find it much more difficult to assassinate her. Just like this, the days passed one after another. Every side had their own plans and calculations, and they were all trying to find out where the others were. Only Qin Yu Hall and Hanya's fleet, the 2 parties involved, were in the calmest and most at ease. They didn't need to do anything, nor did they need to consider any plans or schemes. All they needed to do was wait patiently. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. Hanya God Emperor's flagship had finally arrived at Qin Yu Hall's territory. In just one more day she would return to the fleet. The 4th Palace Master and 2,000 elite Divine King experts followed closely behind Pan Ruo Emperor God and were about to reach the Seven Moon Mountain. At this time, the master of Qin Yu Hall and the 2 marshals had received the news and were waiting with complicated emotions. Ji Tianxing calculated the time and guessed that Hanya God Emperor was about to return. He stopped meditating and began to vigilantly monitor his surroundings. Chapter 4488. For everyone it was a long and torturous day. The master of Qin Yu Hall was very nervous. He didn't know what would happen when he met the 4th Palace Master from the Temple of Light. Because of his impulsiveness and dereliction of duty, he had caused such a disaster, causing the Prajna God Emperor to no longer join the Kongming Temple, causing great losses to the Temple of Light. How angry were the Palace Masters? How would the 4th Palace Master punish him when he came with the 1st Palace Master's decree? The Master of Qin Yu Hall wasn't sure, so he was uneasy and even a little panicked. But the news of the 4th Palace Master's impending arrival made the protectors, elders, and deacons under his command heave a sigh of relief. These people only knew that since the 4th Palace Master had come, he would definitely deal with the aftermath, and the Mount of 7 Moons would no longer be in danger. As for how the 4th Palace Master would punish the Master of Qin Yu Hall, that had nothing to do with them. On the other side, the 2 marshals of the Prajna fleet felt the same as the Master of Qin Yu Hall. They were also very uneasy. Although they had been very frightened a month ago, they had guessed that the Prajna God Emperor wouldn't let them off easily after committing such a big mistake. But with a month's buffer, they could still imagine that the Prajna God Emperor's anger would dissipate, and the punishment would be reduced. But in this month, the Prajna God Emperor hadn't contacted them. Until today, Wuxia Deity King sent a message back, saying that they would be able to return to the fleet in one day. The Prajna God Emperor's attitude made the 2 marshals realize that the situation was very serious, and that the God Emperor's anger hadn't dissipated. They didn't need to think to know that they would be in trouble in one day. But the biggest suspense was how the Prajna God Emperor would punish them, and to what extent they would be in trouble. It was also the source of their uneasiness. Could it be that the Prajna God Emperor would kill them to vent his anger? If it was before, Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi would have denied this idea, thinking that it was very unlikely. But now the two marshals didn't dare to be sure. The torturous day for many people was finally over. The next morning, the Prajna god emperor's warship passed by Mount Seven Moons and headed straight for the southern fleet. The Prajna god emperor's divine sense had discovered that the gates of the Seven Moons mountain were tightly shut. The defensive formation had been activated and they were on full alert. The battleship did not stop. A cold light flashed in her eyes. She sneered and quickly left. Her hatred for Qing Yu Hall hadn't diminished in the slightest. When the time was right, she would definitely flatten those mountains and destroy the entire city. Shua. The battleship cut through the clouds and quickly disappeared into the horizon. In another 2 hours, the Prajna god emperor would return to the fleet. She could already imagine how nervous Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi were right now and how nervous they were. However, she had already decided on how to punish the two marshals a month ago, and she would not change it even now. As the battleship left Seven Moon Mountain, it got closer and closer to the fleet. 8 million miles, 7 million miles, 6 million miles. As time passed, the Prajna god emperor's calm and indifferent state of mind suddenly fluctuated. For some reason, as she got closer and closer to the fleet, she subconsciously felt a trace of nervousness and uneasiness. She had a vague feeling that there was a vague danger ahead, like a pitch-black abyss waiting for her to step into. This sudden premonition, moreover, it was a crisis. She immediately became vigilant. Premonitions were illusory things that couldn't be seen or touched. However, after reaching her level of strength and condensing 3 strands of Taoist rhyme, she could naturally sense the heavenly Tao. It was natural for her to suddenly feel a sense of danger when danger was about to arrive, and it had happened more than once. The Prajna god emperor wasn't overly suspicious. Without hesitation, she chose to believe in her premonitions and premonitions. She raised her eyebrows and was about to ask Xianxia to stop the battleship. She would make the appropriate decision after she investigated the situation and figured out the source of the danger. However, the danger came so suddenly that she was caught off guard. Just as she called out Crimson Afterglow's name, before she could stop him, a sudden change occurred in front of her. Whoosh! Between the majestic mountain ranges, a dazzling divine light shot into the sky. The dazzling brilliance covered a radius of 30,000 miles and instantly formed a massive divine array, like a giant bowl overturned on the ground. As the 5-colored semicircle of light flowed, it released a terrifying divine power that pressed down. The Prajna god emperor's battleship was also suppressed, as if it had sunk into a quagmire, its speed dropping by 80%. There really is an ambush. A cold glint flashed in the Prajna god emperor's eyes as a chilling murderous intent erupted from her body. It's a trap. Xianxia was instantly alerted. Her eyes widened as her expression turned grave. Without any warning, she steered the battleship straight into the enemy's trap. At this moment she was both shocked and furious as well as a little regretful. The master and disciple's first reaction was that this must be a trap set by the Kongming temple to kill the Prajna god emperor while she was on her way back to the fleet. Since she was unwilling to join the Kongming temple, she was an enemy of the Kongming temple. If you can't have it, destroy it. This was the life creed of many powerful people. Therefore, after Xianxia came to her senses, she immediately controlled the array to steer the battleship away from the range of the array. However, this massive array of 30,000 miles was a quasi-emperor divine array. Not only was it composed of 3 supreme king-level divine arrays, but it also contained the power of the heavenly Tao. Its divine power was vast and unfathomable. This divine array didn't have much offensive power. It only had the effect of sealing off heaven and earth and suppressing everything. Then another array of the same level was activated. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. 100,000 dazzling swords of light suddenly lit up in the area of 30,000 miles, weaving into a massive sword net. Each sword light was 10,000 feet long. 100,000 swords of light gathered together to form a massive sword array and unleash an astonishing attack. Swish, 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 swish. Tens of thousands of swords of light danced, carrying the power to destroy everything as they began to attack the Prajna god emperor's battleship. Seeing this, Xianxia gave up on running away without hesitation. Instead, she steered the battleship to form a shield and used all her strength to defend against the swords of light. The Prajna god emperor was in no hurry to attack. Instead, she frowned as she stared at the 2 arrays and observed the swords of light. For some reason, when she saw the hundreds of thousands of sword lights dancing in the sky, she felt that they were somewhat familiar. The path of the swords of light, the network of the sword array, and the aura of the swords of light all seemed familiar. At this moment her resolve wavered. She suddenly felt that the trap and ambush here might not be the work of the Kongming Temple. It was more like the work of someone she once knew, someone hidden in the depths of her heart. Chapter 4489. Beauregard Emperor's heart that was as calm as an ancient well suddenly cracked and rippled. She knew that person was far away in the God Realm, perhaps still busy unifying the God Realm and setting new rules for the various continents. No matter what, that person couldn't have appeared here, much less set up a trap here. However, the ceiling formation in front of her and the sword formation formed by the 100,000 sword lights were very real and familiar to her. While she was in a daze, the divine warship had just formed a defensive barrier when the sword glows came crashing down. Bam, bam, bam. Rumble, rumble, rumble. With deafening booms, the endless sword glows slammed into the divine warship's defensive barrier, causing it to explode into fragments of divine light. The defensive light barrier with a radius of 3,000 meters only lasted for a breath of time before it was shattered into pieces by the sword light that filled the sky, causing dense cracks to appear on its surface. Then even more divine sword glows slammed into Pan-Re-God Emperor's warship. The Supreme Grade King warship shuddered violently, and cracks began to appear on its surface. Crimson Dawn's face paled. He wanted to control the warship to form another barrier, but it was too late. More and more divine sword glows slammed into the warship, causing it to sway from side to side as the cracks on its surface continued to expand. Crimson Dawn was powerless to stop the assault of the two arrays. He could only turn to his master behind him. If Pan-Re-God Emperor did not act, the ceiling array and the sword array would probably tear the warship to shreds. Fortunately, Pan-Re-God Emperor finally came to her senses and began to cast her arts. She temporarily suppressed the distracting thoughts in her mind and sat cross-legged in the warship. She formed a divine seal with both hands, releasing endless divine power in every direction. Whoosh! In the blink of an eye, the dazzling five-colored divine light condensed into a huge light shield that protected the entire divine warship. Pan-Ruo Emperor God's five-colored light barrier also contained a trace of Tao rhyme and possessed the power of heavenly Tao. As a result, the tens of thousands of sword lights that filled the sky and shuttled back and forth were all blocked by the multicolored light shield. They could no longer harm the battleship. Crimson Dawn heaved a sigh of relief but did not dare to delay. He hurriedly controlled the array to repair the damage to the divine warship. Next, the battle became a contest between Pan-Re-God Emperor and the two arrays. Ji Tianxing remained hidden in the dark, expressionless as he watched Pan-Re-God Emperor's warship. He silently controlled the ceiling array and the heaven-destroying sword array to attack continuously. Pan-Re-God Emperor's strength was indeed not to be underestimated. Her divine power seemed to be endless, and it was like raging waves, each wave stronger than the one before it. Even if the five-colored light barrier that she conjured was constantly being bombarded with holes and cracks by the sword light, she could quickly repair it. In short, she held on for a full 45 minutes. Her divine power was still surging without any decrease in the slightest. The five-colored barrier protected the warship, preventing it from being damaged further. Under Crimson Dawn's repair, the warship gradually recovered to normal. At this time, Crimson Dawn finally had a chance to catch her breath. She hurriedly took out a communication jade slip to send a message to Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi, ordering them to come to her aid. However, Pan-Re-God Emperor could still spare some attention to this matter. She said in a dignified tone, "There is no need to send a message to them. They are now in seclusion to heal their injuries. Even if they come, it will be useless. Not only will they not solve the problem, they will also become a burden." Crimson Dawn felt that this made sense, so she dismissed the idea of sending a message to the two marshals. After all, the soldiers were all seriously injured and there were not many available. Moreover, the two arrays that had ambushed them were quasi-emperor divine arrays with unfathomable power. Even if the two marshals arrived with a group of elite soldiers, they would not be able to break the divine arrays from the outside. The greater possibility was that the two marshals and the soldiers they brought with them would be easily killed by the ambushers and they would lose their lives for nothing. Thinking of this, Crimson Dawn was somewhat puzzled. She could not help but ask, Master, if the experts of the Kongming Temple were lying in ambush here, why did they only set up a large array and not appear? Pan-Ri God Emperor continued to cast spells to resist the two large arrays. She replied expressionlessly, although at the beginning, I also guessed that it was the experts of the Kongming Temple who had set up an ambush here. However, from the looks of it now, they might not be from the Kongming Temple. I have a general understanding of the mystic arts of the desolate race, as well as the habits and thoughts of casting spells. Therefore, I can conclude that these two divine arrays are not the work of the experts of the Kongming Temple. It is more likely that they are experts from the divine realm. Furthermore, they are people who have grasped the profound meaning of the sword to be able to set up such a sword array. Hearing the last sentence, Crimson Dawn frowned. A glint flashed in her eyes as she suddenly came to a realization. Master, a person who has grasped the profound meaning of the sword? Could you be talking about that person? After pausing for a moment, Crimson Dawn could not help but shake her head. Her face was filled with disbelief as she said, "That is impossible. That is absolutely impossible. That person has just ruled the divine realm. He must be reorganizing the various continents and establishing new rules to consolidate his hegemony. How could he have left the divine realm? How could he have come to the Star of Origin?" Pan-Ri God Emperor naturally understood this point. Therefore she was only guessing and did not dare to confirm it. Since Crimson Dawn was pressing, she could only explain, "I am only guessing and cannot confirm it. However, don't worry. Since the other party has set up an ambush here and cannot defeat us for a long time, they will definitely appear later." Crimson Dawn nodded and did not say anything else. She continued to control the divine worship and coordinated with her master to launch a counterattack. Both sides were in a stalemate for another 15 minutes. However, it was still difficult to determine the victor. Pan-Ri God Emperor could not break through the heaven-destroying sword array and the sealing array. The divine worship could not escape from the two arrays. However, no matter how strong the heaven-destroying sword array was, it could not destroy Pan-Ri God Emperor's defensive light barrier. It could not harm her divine worship. Ji Tianxing, who was controlling the array in the dark, was unwilling to give up. He thought to himself, "I underestimated Pan-Ri's strength. It seems that she has at least condensed 2 Taoist rhymes. Might even be 3. Since the array could not do anything to Pan-Ri God Emperor, he could not keep stalling for time. Otherwise, the two marshals would sense that something was amiss. It was very likely that they would bring reinforcements. More importantly, if he delayed for too long, the temple master sent by the Kongming Temple might also sense it. At that time, if the temple master of the Kongming Temple got involved, the situation would become even more complicated. Therefore, Ji Tianxing could only reveal himself and appear in the sky in front of the divine worship. He stared at Pan-Ri God Emperor's divine worship and said coldly, "Pan-Ri, long time no see." It was these simple words that stunned Pan-Ri God Emperor. She even forgot to continue casting her spell. Chapter 4490. The moment Ji Tianxing appeared, both the Prajna God Emperor and Crimson Dawn raised their eyebrows, their pupils constricting as they stared at him. The same thought flashed through their minds at the same time. He's finally appeared. After setting up an ambush here, the culprit who attacked them had finally appeared. However, neither the master nor disciple had expected this, nor could they believe their eyes, nor could they accept this result. The person who attacked them was actually Feiyang Shenwang. That's right, it was Feiyang Shenwang who was highly regarded and trusted by Crimson Dawn. At the same time, it was also the main culprit behind the battle between the Prajna fleet and Qinyu Hall. To everyone's knowledge, this person who had first provoked Qinyu Hall and participated in many battles had already died on the battlefield, reduced to ashes. Before returning to the fleet, Crimson Dawn had sent a message to the two marshals asking about Feiyang Shenwang's whereabouts. The two marshals had replied very confidently that Feiyang Shenwang had died in the battle long ago, and even his bones could not be found. But now godly King Feiyang had appeared unscathed. Of course, if it was only because of this, it would only cause a great shock to the Prajna God Emperor and Crimson Dawn. It would not be enough to cause the Prajna God Emperor to be stunned and reveal a flaw in her mental state. Most importantly, the Feiyang Shenwang in front of them was definitely not the real Feiyang Shenwang. Not only did he have the strength and aura of a God Emperor, but he could also set up 2 quasi-emperor level formations. Especially his posture and dignified aura, It was definitely not something that Feiyang Shenwang could possess. And what shocked the Prajna God Emperor the most were those 5 words. Long time no see, Prajna. In today's world, only those God Emperors had the qualifications and dared to call her Prajna. Moreover, the other party's tone was so familiar, and the words long time no see indicated that they had known each other for many years but had not seen each other for many years. With the wisdom of the Prajna God Emperor, as well as her familiarity with that person, her first reaction was that the Feiyang Shenwang in front of her was a fake. It was that person in disguise. Thus, the Prajna God Emperor subconsciously exclaimed, Kenshin. Long Tian? It's actually you? However, Ji Tianqing did not respond to her, nor did he say anything else. When he shouted those 5 words, it was precisely to purposely destroy Hanya God Emperor's mental state, for the sake of breaking through the defensive barrier she condensed. He had already brought out the sword of burial of heaven and poured all of his strength into the divine sword. He slashed at the Prajna God Emperor's flagship. Boom! Before the Prajna God Emperor and Crimson Afterglow could react, the sword light that contained the might of the heavenly way struck the 5-colored light barrier formed by the Prajna God Emperor. With a deafening sound, the 5-colored light barrier was split in half. Countless cracks appeared in the huge gap, and tens of thousands of shards of divine light burst out. The defensive barrier that the heaven-destroying sword formation had been unable to break through was finally broken. The Prajna God Emperor, who was completely stunned and lost her mental state, also suffered from the backlash of her power. Her body shook and her face turned ghastly pale. However, this also brought her back to her senses. She immediately glared at Ji Tianqing and shouted angrily, Long Tian, you're despicable. At this moment she no longer had the spare energy to think about how Kenshin had appeared here. How and when did Kenshin enter the planet of origin? How did he find her so accurately, and how did he disguise himself as Feiyang Shenwang to create this series of conspiracies? There were too many questions that the Prajna God Emperor suppressed in her heart. She only knew that Kenshin had purposely shouted those 5 words, taking advantage of her distraction to launch a sneak attack on her. This was too despicable. The Prajna God Emperor was furious, but she also knew that it was impossible for her to create another barrier. Seeing Ji Tianqing swing his sword again and unleash a few heaven-shattering sword auras, she rushed out of the divine worship without hesitation and formed a seal with her hands to block. Swish! Dressed in a red dress, Prajna appeared in the sky in her true form. She was extremely graceful and beautiful, and the red dot on her forehead made her look even more noble and holy. Her face was as cold as ice, and her hands lit up with 5-colored divine light. She quickly cast a spell, manipulating the divine power of heaven and earth to form a 10,000-foot-tall golden divine seal in front of her. The giant golden divine seal stood between Ji Tianqing and her, keeping the divine worship behind it. Bang bang bang. Ji Tianqing's 3 heaven-shattering swords were meant to destroy the Prajna God Emperor's divine worship, but they struck the golden divine seal, creating an earth-shattering boom. The 10,000-foot-long divine sword exploded, filling the sky with fragments of divine light. The Prajna God Emperor's golden divine seal was also cleaved in half, turning into specks of divine light that dissipated into the world. There was no doubt that the 2 of them had used their full strength, but it was a draw. Such an outcome caused Emperor God Panruo's eyes to widen and he revealed a look of disbelief. Long Tian, you were just a peak God King not long ago. How could you have broken through to the God Emperor realm so quickly? The Prajna God Emperor had long expected that the 6th God Emperor would be Kenshin Long Tian. But she had calculated that no matter how heaven-defying Long Tian's talent was, he would need to cultivate for several hundred years before breaking through. But now, in just a few short years, Long Tian had broken through to the God Emperor realm. What shocked her the most was that Long Tian had just become a God Emperor, but he was already on par with her. This was simply too absurd. The Prajna God Emperor's state of mind rose and fell like a raging sea. God King Crimson Dawn also recognized the reality and woke up from her shock. She glared angrily at Ji Tianqing and cursed with hatred, Long Tian, you despicable and shameless bastard. You are a disgrace to the name of the Kenshin. How could you do such a despicable thing? No wonder Feiyang Shenwang was able to cheat me of my trust and take the initiative to provoke a conflict with Qin Yu Hall after we left the fleet. So it turns out that you have already possessed divine King Feiyang's body and deliberately created a conflict. It was your scheme that caused the fleet and Qinyu Hall to fight until both sides were injured. You are too sinister and vicious. God King Crimson Dawn was able to guess the cause and the truth of the matter in just a few short moments. She had seen through Ji Tianxing's scheme. But it was already too late for her and the Prajna God Emperor to find out the truth. Ji Tianxing's expression was indifferent as he swung his sword and attacked. He only said one sentence. We are enemies to begin with. What's the point of talking about morality? This sentence left the master and disciple duo speechless. They could not refute or retaliate. That's right, they were not friends or allies. They were mortal enemies. Of course they would do anything for revenge. What was wrong with that? Ji Tianxing's left hand unleashed all sorts of mystic arts and secret techniques while his right hand waved the burial of heaven. He unleashed a series of swordsmanship techniques against the Prajna God Emperor. He was like a fish in water within the heaven-sealing formation and the heaven-destroying sword formation. He was like the ruler of this world. Meanwhile, the Prajna God Emperor and God King Crimson Dawn were suppressed within the formation and their strength was greatly reduced. As expected, Ji Tianxing quickly gained the upper hand. Chapter 4491. The Prajna God Emperor was suppressed by the two arrays and was unable to unleash her full strength. She was constantly being suppressed by Ji Tianxing. She could not turn the tables, nor could she break through the heaven-vanquishing sword array and the heaven-sealing array. Xianxia was also in a difficult situation. She was in the Prajna God Emperor's ship and had the protection of the divine ship. However, the Prajna God Emperor could not conjure a divine light barrier to protect the divine ship. The divine ship could only endure the attacks of the 10,000 rays of sword light. It was riddled with holes and filled with cracks. Even though godly monarch Crimson Afterglow and the 20 elite guards tried their best to cast spells to defend and repair the divine warship as quickly as possible, it was useless. They could only delay the destruction of the divine ship slightly, but they could not resolve the crisis. As time passed, the damage and cracks on the divine ship grew larger and larger. Xianxia and the 20 guards could not keep up with the speed of repair and became more and more flustered. Finally, when the divine ship's damage reached its limit, it shattered under the attacks of the dozens of rays of sword light. The entire divine ship broke into pieces and countless pieces of the divine ship flew everywhere. The 20 elite guards were also engulfed by the rays of sword light and were torn to pieces. They let out cries of pain and a dark red mist of blood. Even though Xianxia had the strength of a peak divine king, she was still struck by the dozens of rays of sword light. Her protective divine light was destroyed and she was badly injured. Her body was drenched in blood. In the blink of an eye, the entire divine ship was torn to shreds and scattered in the heaven-vanquishing sword array. The 12 guards were torn to pieces by the sword light. Their deaths were too horrible to look at. Not even their corpses were left intact. The 8 guards who were lucky enough to survive were also seriously injured. They gathered together to defend against the attacks of the sword light. However, it was all in vain. The divine sword light that blotted out the sky quickly engulfed their figures. After 2 breaths, the 8 guards no longer existed. They were reduced to a rain of blood and dust that dissipated into the world. Only the injured Xianxia was left. She was still bitterly holding on, using all her strength to defend against the sword light. The Prajna God Emperor saw that she was having a hard time. Under the attack of the countless sword lights, her injuries were worsening. If another 10 breaths of time passed, her divine body would very likely collapse. With no other choice, Prajna God Emperor could only divert a portion of his energy to help Crimson Dawn God King relieve half of the pressure. The pressure on Xianxia Deity King was greatly reduced and only then was he able to move. He quickly approached his master. But even so, godly monarch Crimson Afterglow's strength was still constantly draining away. His combat strength was becoming weaker and weaker. A quarter of an hour later, she had almost no energy left to resist the sword light that filled the sky. She could only support the suppression of the double array. There was nothing she could do about it. Ji Tianxing had set up 2 large formations 20 days in advance. Both of them contained the powerful might of the heavenly Tao and had an extremely strong suppressive force on her. Prajna God Emperor had no choice but to shoulder more of the pressure and do his best to protect Crimson Dawn. Unknowingly, the 2 sides had already fought for nearly 2 hours. The power of the heaven-sealing formation and the heaven-vanquishing sword formation had not weakened. They were able to absorb the power of heaven and earth within a radius of 1,000,000 miles, which meant that they had an endless supply of power. Prajna God Emperor's divine power was gradually depleting, and her battle prowess began to weaken. She was constantly being suppressed by Ji Tianxing and was about to be injured soon. Prajna God Emperor could not believe or accept such an outcome. She could only think of ways to stall for time. As she fought with Ji Tianxing, she asked, "Long Tian, I still don't understand. Why are you not in the heavenly realm? Why are you here? I have spent close to 1,000 years of effort and the efforts of tens of thousands of soldiers to finally break through the defenses of the Star of Origin and successfully enter the Star of Origin. How did you do it?" Ji Tianxing becoming a god emperor in such a short period of time had already exceeded her expectations. Now Ji Tianxing was also able to break through the defenses of the Star of Origin and enter the Star of Origin. This was simply unbelievable. Ji Tianxing continued to attack expressionlessly. He asked indifferently, "Who told you that I had to break through the defenses of the Star of Origin to enter?" Hearing this, Prajna God Emperor frowned and said subconsciously, "What do you mean? Can you easily break through the defenses of the Star of Origin and enter the Star of Origin? That's impossible. I and the other 4 God Emperors have tried. It's impossible." Pausing for a moment, she suddenly thought of another possibility and suddenly understood. "I understand. After you conquered the heavenly realm, you did not stay in the heavenly realm. You immediately rushed into the depths of the void to find us. After you found us and saw that we had successfully opened a gap, you followed us into the Star of Origin. That must be it." Ji Tianxing did not reply, which meant that he had tacitly agreed with her guess. In fact, Prajna God Emperor was just shocked and agitated. She had been in a state of battle and did not have time to think about it. If she had calmed down after the incident, she would have thought of this. Seeing that Ji Tianxing had tacitly agreed, Prajna God Emperor felt more confident. She continued, "You have been following my fleet until we entered the 7 Moons Mountain. Perhaps you had already thought of a way to sneak into the fleet and possess Xianxia. Or perhaps you were hiding in the dark and waited for me and Crimson Afterglow to leave before sneaking into my fleet. However, after thinking about it, I still think that the possibility of you sneaking into the fleet ahead of time is higher. After all, before I left the fleet and went to the Kongming Temple, Xianxia's behavior was somewhat abnormal. At that time I noticed this but did not think much of it. I also did not expect that Xianxia had already been possessed by you." Mentioning what had happened before, Crimson Afterglow was filled with regret and hatred. She glared at Ji Tianxing and cursed, "Long Tian. In any case, you are a peerless expert who made a name for yourself 1,000 years ago. In front of me you are a senior. But you actually pretended to be Xianxia and purposely got close to me to gain my trust. Then you sowed discord and caused such tragic consequences. Where is your dignity and grace as a senior? You are too shameless, too despicable." Ji Tianxing glanced at Crimson Afterglow indifferently and said, "You are still too young. You." Crimson Afterglow was furious, but there was nothing she could do. She could only glare at Ji Tianxing angrily and pant. Prajna God Emperor knew that there was no point in continuing this topic. It would only make people angrier. Thus she continued to ask Ji Tianxing, "You have only broken through to the God Emperor realm in the past 2 years. At most you have condensed a strand of Taoist rhyme. But I have already condensed 3 strands of Taoist rhyme. Even if you set up 2 divine formations in advance, it is impossible to suppress me. Long Tian, how did you do it? Do you know some secret, or is the heaven punishing formation in your hands?" Prajna God Emperor and the other 4 God Emperors had already discussed this. Back then they had only snatched half of a divine item from Kenshin. It was called the Eternal Heavenly Tome. The other half of the divine item, the heaven punishing formation, was missing. Chapter 4492. The 5 God Emperors had never seen the true face of the heaven punishment formation, nor did they know its contents. But they guessed that since the first half of the eternal heavenly scripture could allow them to break through to the God Emperor realm, then the second half of the heaven punishment formation must have even more unfathomable power. Long Tian's various monstrous performances after returning to the God realm made them increasingly suspicious that the heaven punishment formation was in Long Tian's hands. Otherwise, the 5 God Emperors had used all sorts of methods, and the God of the underworld had even used the Heaven Punisher race to set up a massive layout in the lower realms. There was no way they couldn't find the heaven punishment formation. Now that the Pan-God Emperor had seen Ji Tianqing's heaven-defying performance, it was only natural that she would have such a thought. Ji Tianqing knew that even if he denied it, the Pan-God Emperor wouldn't believe him. Thus he didn't answer the Pan-God Emperor's question. He only sneered, "Back in the God realm I was still a peak God King, but I was already able to defeat your avatar. Now that I've broken through to the initial God Emperor realm, we're on the same level. You've only condensed 1 or 2 more Daos than me, so what's so strange about me being able to suppress you?" The Pan-God Emperor thought that this made sense. Ever since Long Tian's rebirth, his performance had been monstrous. There was only a difference of 2 Daos between her and Long Tian. In any case, they were both at the initial God Emperor realm. With Long Tian's monstrous aptitude and talent, it was understandable that he could firmly suppress her. Even though the Pan-God Emperor understood this, she was still very angry when she heard Ji Tianqing's words, especially his tone. She looked coldly at Ji Tianqing and said in a low voice, "Long Tian, this emperor admits that you're very strong right now, and this emperor might not be your match. But don't forget that you and I are both at the initial God Emperor realm and have grasped the power of the heavenly Tao. At our level, although we haven't reached eternal life, we're not easy to kill. If you want to kill me, you're dreaming." Ji Tianqing had been expressionless until he heard these words. Finally he sneered. "Hanya, you're right. With my current strength I can only suppress and defeat you. I don't have the confidence to kill you. But the goal of my plan doesn't necessarily have to be to kill you. As long as we can destroy your soldiers, cut off your foundation and make you a loner, you will not be able to establish yourself on the Star of Origin, let alone realize your ambitions. Moreover, even if I can't kill you today, it doesn't mean that I can't kill you in a few years." As he spoke, he suddenly unleashed a powerful godly power. While dealing with the Prajna God Emperor, he also stabbed Xia God King a few times. The Prajna God Emperor was unable to react in time, and his defense was immediately broken by the sword light. He was unable to protect godly monarch Crimson Dawn. With 2 dull thuds, Crimson Afterglow was struck by the sword light. His body trembled violently as blood spewed from his nose and mouth. Crimson Afterglow was already heavily injured. After suffering such heavy injuries, his face was as white as a sheet of paper and his aura was extremely weak. The Prajna God Emperor frowned fiercely as the anger in her heart grew. Ji Tianqing's actions were undoubtedly telling her that even if he couldn't kill her, he could easily kill her most beloved disciple. But the situation was not good. The Prajna God Emperor could only suppress her anger and ask in a cold voice, "Long Tian, don't you dare slander me. When did this emperor have any ambitions? Other than seeking eternal life, that is the goal that all godly kings and God Emperor pursue. What kind of ambition is that? Moreover, you know that it was Yu Ming, Azura, Dao Xingyun and Lu Zhiyang who planned to kill you. Why didn't you seek revenge on them? Why did you only target me and follow me to the Star of Origin? Don't tell me that as the famous Kenshin, you are also someone who bullies the weak and fears the strong?" With the Prajna God Emperor's proud and aloof personality, she had never said such words before. Even if she wasn't the mastermind behind the plan to kill the Kenshin, but was forced by circumstances to cooperate with the 4 God Emperors, she had never said anything. She had only announced to the outside world that she had a grudge against the Kenshin and that she had participated in the plot. But today she had spoken the truth about the situation and her thoughts. From this, it could be seen that she wasn't afraid of death or worried about her own safety. She cared deeply about Crimson Dawn's life. Ji Tianqing saw the clues and frowned as he stared at Crimson Dawn, silently recalling the events of the past. For the Prajna God Emperor to care so much about Crimson Dawn made him wonder if Crimson Dawn had any other identity besides being Prajna's favorite disciple. But Ji Tianqing carefully recalled for a moment and sorted out Crimson Dawn's identity and background, and the process of him becoming Prajna's disciple. He was sure that there was no other relationship between the two. After all, when the Prajna God Emperor took Crimson Dawn as his disciple, he had just separated from the God Emperor not long ago. He was also very clear about the matter of Prajna taking in a disciple. After dispelling the misgivings in his heart, Ji Tianqing looked at the Prajna God Emperor and asked, "Why do you care so much about Crimson Dawn's life? Logically speaking, as an expert of the God Emperor, you should be indifferent to everything. How can you still have the emotions of a mortal?" The Prajna God Emperor sneered, "You are now also an initial God Emperor. Could it be that you have already extinguished the 7 emotions and 6 desires, completely eliminating mortal emotions? If that was the case, wouldn't you have abandoned your wife and children long ago? Ji Tianxing frowned, not intending to answer her question. The Prajna God Emperor continued, after I broke off with you, it was this emperor's darkest, most lost, most dejected and most helpless period. It was precisely at that time that this emperor realized the coldness and selfishness of the human heart. Being full of sincerity definitely won't be enough to exchange for someone else's sincerity. If one is too naive, the one who will be hurt in the end will only be oneself. It was also during that period that this emperor met Crimson Dawn, who was similarly hurt and similarly lost. At that time she was too pure and too kind. When I saw her, this emperor felt as if I was looking at my younger self. Perhaps it was precisely because of this that we became master and disciple. From then on, this emperor secretly made the decision to teach Crimson Dawn with all of my strength to protect her. Apart from this, there is no one else in this world that is worthy of sincerity. The Prajna God Emperor sneered, speaking these words with a complicated tone. Of course, Ji Tianxing could tell that these were her true thoughts. There was absolutely no element of disguise. Of course, it was also because the current situation was special with only him, Prajna and Crimson Dawn here. Ji Tianxing believed that after today, in a different situation with the Prajna God Emperor's nature, she definitely wouldn't say such words again. He immediately became silent, looking at the Prajna God Emperor with a complicated expression. In a daze, he seemed to have returned to 1,000 years ago, seeing the Prajna God Emperor who was still somewhat young and inexperienced. Even though he didn't know what the Prajna God Emperor experienced in those several decades after he broke off with her. But he could guess that the Prajna God Emperor must have been very depressed during that period of time, very torturous. There was already no meaning in arguing about who was right and who was wrong about the matters of the past. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4493. The past could not be recalled. Ji Tianxing understood that the Prajna God Emperor was not admitting her wrongs or repenting by saying these words. In all fairness, it was more like the Prajna God Emperor was admitting defeat and pleading for mercy. She was in an undefeatable position. Even if she was suppressed by Ji Tianxing, her life would not be in danger. But other than herself, the one she cared about the most was Crimson Dawn. Although Ji Tianxing could not kill her, he had absolute confidence that he could kill Crimson Dawn. Ji Tianxing fell silent. He no longer argued with the Prajna God Emperor and continued to attack with an indifferent expression. The Prajna God Emperor's pressure grew greater and greater. Crimson Dawn's injuries also grew more and more serious. She gradually lost her ability to fight. She no longer had the strength to defend against Ji Tianxing's attacks. She could not even block the might of the Great Heaven-Sealing Formation and the Heaven-Destroying Sword Formation. In at most 100 breaths of time, the Prajna God Emperor would not be able to protect her. At that time she would definitely be torn to shreds by the light and shadows of divine techniques. Of course, the Prajna God Emperor had also considered putting Crimson Dawn into her divine tool and letting her fight with Ji Tianxing alone. But Ji Tianxing had long been prepared for this. He had been suppressing the Prajna God Emperor from beginning to end, so that she could not be distracted. If she dared to forcefully open the inner space of the divine tool and put Crimson Dawn inside, she would definitely expose a big flaw. In that case, she would definitely reveal an even bigger flaw, allowing Ji Tianxing to take advantage of it and injure her severely. Her life might even be in danger. Under such circumstances, the Prajna God Emperor became more and more anxious and helpless. She angrily shouted, "Long Tian, do you really want to kill us, master and disciple? You want to take revenge on this emperor? This is a grudge between us. This emperor has nothing to say. But what wrong did Crimson Dawn do? What happened back then had nothing to do with her." Ji Tianxing remained silent. He continued to use all kinds of divine techniques to attack the master and disciple. A few hours ago, Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi had been waiting anxiously for the return of the Prajna God Emperor. They estimated that after the Prajna God Emperor passed by 7 Moon Mountain, they would arrive at the fleet in 2 hours. However, 2 hours had passed and there was still no sign of the divine warship in the northern sky. Marshal Zhou, Marshal Shi, and the more than 20 divine generals who were waiting eagerly were all puzzled. Everyone was guessing if there was a deviation in the calculation of time. Or perhaps the God Emperor's ship was delayed on the way. It was also possible that the God Emperor couldn't hold back his anger and charged into Seven Moon Mountain to deal with the people of Qingyu Hall. All three guesses were possible. However, no one could be sure, so they could only continue to wait and silently pray that nothing unexpected would happen. Time trickled by. Soon another 15 minutes had passed. Given the speed of the Prajna God Emperor's ship, even if there were some delays on the way, they should have arrived by now. However, the Prajna God Emperor and Crimson Dawn still hadn't returned. Marshal Shi, Marshal Zhou, and the other divine generals were panicking. The third guess kept circling in their minds and they couldn't get rid of it. Everyone gathered together and discussed for a while. They were increasingly certain that the God Emperor had most likely charged into Seven Moon Mountain to destroy Qingyu Hall. Given the Prajna God Emperor's nature, he definitely hated Qingyu Hall to the core. Moreover, he was the supreme God Emperor. He had enough power to deal with Qingyu Hall. Thinking of this, the divine generals felt their blood boil. They were full of anticipation. In their hearts, the Prajna God Emperor was their greatest backer. She was also a symbol of strength and invincibility. Previously, when they were bullied by Qingyu Hall, they had fantasized countless times about how good it would be if the Prajna God Emperor was in charge of the fleet. She could easily destroy Qingyu Hall. Now the Prajna God Emperor had finally returned to avenge the soldiers and destroy Qingyu Hall. How could they not be excited? The divine generals were so excited that they urged the two marshals to lead the fleet to support the Prajna God Emperor. Even though most of the soldiers were recuperating from their injuries, there were still some soldiers who could pilot the ship. When the time came to attack Qingyu Hall, the soldiers didn't need to fight. They only needed to pilot the ship to attack and support the Prajna God Emperor. After all, the marshals were going to fight personally. The soldiers under their command had to charge as well. Otherwise, it would be the same as Pan Ruo Divine Emperor flattening the Pure Moon Hall, but his fleet didn't respond at all. That would definitely anger Pan Ruo. The 20-odd divine generals' suggestion was very reasonable. The two marshals were a little swayed. They didn't dare to make the decision on their own. They sent out communication jade slips to ask the Prajna God Emperor whether they needed the fleet to support the Prajna God Emperor. However, the two marshals sent out 3 communication jade slips one after another, but all of them were like stones sinking into the sea and there was no response. This made the two marshals and the divine generals panic. They were even more certain of their guess. The Prajna God Emperor was definitely attacking Qingyu Hall. That was why she didn't have time to reply. Therefore, the two marshals didn't hesitate anymore. They quickly gathered more than 20 divine generals and commanded dozens of soldiers to pilot the warships. In a short while, the fleet of 50 warships was led by the two marshals and headed straight for Seven Moon Mountain. Along the way, the soldiers were filled with excitement and anticipation. They imagined the scene of the Prajna God Emperor going on a killing spree and the scene of Seven Moon Mountain being destroyed. They felt very relieved. The soldiers piloting the divine warships kept increasing their speed. They wanted to reach Seven Moon Mountain as soon as possible so that they wouldn't miss the show. Everyone knew that they might not be of much use even if they participated in the battle. However, they had to show their attitude and boost the God Emperor's morale. Most importantly, the soldiers wanted to see the tragic scene of Qingyu Hall being destroyed with their own eyes. About an hour later, the fleet was only halfway there. They were still 5 million miles away from Seven Moon Mountain. At this moment, the two marshals and the divine generals saw a huge array with a radius of 30,000 miles in front of them. That should be a sealing array. The semicircular 5-colored barrier covered the ground and kept absorbing the power of heaven and earth from all directions. The grade of the array was extremely high. It released a terrifying suppressive force that contained an indescribable divine might. However, no one could see the situation inside the sealing array. However, the formation was shining brightly and muffled booms and explosions could be heard from time to time. The two marshals and the many soldiers were experienced. They immediately concluded that there must be experts fighting inside the array. What's going on? Why would someone set up an array here and fight with others? Looking at the grade of the sealing array, it's obviously beyond the supreme grade king level. It also contains a wisp of heavenly Tao's might. Therefore, it must be the array set up by the God Emperor. The two marshals looked at each other and realized that the situation was not good. They frowned worriedly. The array set up by the God Emperor? The God Emperor just returned from the Kongming Temple and passed by here not long ago. This array is definitely not set up by her. So, there's only one possibility. The God Emperor of the Kongming Temple set up the array here to ambush the God Emperor. Chapter 4494. Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi were both peak divine kings and had rich battle experience. In the blink of an eye they had analyzed the truth through the array in front of them. Thus, the two marshals' hearts suddenly jumped, and their expressions also became serious. Damn it! Why would the Kongming Temple send a God Emperor expert to ambush the God Emperor here? I understand now. We fought with Qing Yu Hall until both sides suffered losses. The God Emperor was unwilling to join the Kongming Temple, which caused the Kongming Temple to be angry and dissatisfied. Since they could not subdue the God Emperor, and both sides had a grudge against each other, the Kongming Temple chose to strike first to gain the upper hand and eliminate us. As expected of an overlord. The Kongming Temple's actions are indeed unyielding and domineering. What are we waiting for? We must use all our strength to break that array and help the God Emperor out of this predicament. Nothing must happen to the God Emperor. Otherwise, without our leader and backer, we will be at the mercy of the Kongming Temple, like ants that can be squashed to death at any time. After a brief discussion, the two marshals reached a consensus. They immediately ordered the fleet to get into battle formation and attack the sealing array with all their might. Swish swish swish. The 50 warships quickly got into formation and fired their divine cannons at the same time, releasing beams of divine power that filled the sky. Thousands of beams of light, carrying the power to destroy heaven and earth, hit the sealing array with a loud bang. Bam, 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 boom, boom. Deafening booms exploded one after another, reverberating endlessly between heaven and earth. The beams of light released by the 50 warships at the same time crashed into the sealing array, but they did not cause any damage. The 5-colored light barrier only trembled a few dozen times, creating layers of ripples and ripples. Not even a crack appeared. Such a powerful force confirmed everyone's guess. That was an emperor-level array. With this thought in mind, the two marshals and the many divine generals began to feel anxious. Reason told everyone that the strength of these soldiers and starships was not enough to shake the emperor-level grand array. However, as the officers and soldiers under the command of the Prajna God Emperor, they knew that the Prajna God Emperor was ambushed and was fighting with experts in the Great Formation. They could not just stand by and watch. Even if they knew that it would be futile, they had to do their best and think of every way to help the Prajna God Emperor deal with the enemy. The two marshals weren't discouraged and gave the order once more, commanding all the warships to attack with all their might. Boom boom boom. One pillar of divine power after another, bursting with dazzling flames, bombarded the grand sealing formation with unstoppable momentum. The two marshals and the 20-odd god generals understood that even if their attacks couldn't break the sealing array, they could at least reduce a portion of the array's power. In this way he could also reduce some of the pressure on Hanya God Emperor, and perhaps help Hanya God Emperor defeat the enemy. In truth, their thinking was correct. Ji Tianxing, the Prajna God Emperor and God King Crimson Dawn all had different reactions when they noticed the fleet outside the array attacking. Ji Tianxing first frowned, but when he realized that the fleet's attack wasn't very strong and could only slightly affect the heaven sealing array, his brow relaxed. In fact, he even had another thought, and the corner of his mouth could not help but reveal a cold smile. The Prajna God Emperor and God King Crimson Dawn had completely opposite reactions. The two of them sensed that a fleet was attacking the sealing array and immediately realized that the two marshals had come to reinforce them. The master and disciple were delighted at first, and then they breathed a sigh of relief. Wonderful. We've been delayed for so long, but the two marshals have finally noticed something strange and come to our aid. However, they soon realized that the attack power of the remaining 50 warships was too weak. They couldn't threaten Ji Tianxing's formation at all. The master and disciples' hopes were immediately dashed. Even if the fleet came to their aid, they wouldn't be able to save them. The Prajna God Emperor then thought of an even more serious problem. Although Kenshin couldn't kill her, he could kill God King Crimson Dawn. As for the 50 divine warships outside the array, if Kenshin put in a little effort, he could also heavily injure and destroy them. At that time, just as Kenshin had said, she would truly be all alone. Thinking of this, Great Wisdom Emperor's expression changed abruptly, revealing a look of deep anxiety. She wanted very much to order the two marshals not to cause any more trouble and to immediately lead the fleet away from this place and hide as far away as possible. Unfortunately, she was unable to receive or check the communication jade slips sent by the two marshals earlier. Now that Ji Tianxing was suppressing her, she couldn't send a message to the two marshals. Just when the Prajna God Emperor was at her wits' end, Ji Tianxing suddenly used a supreme ability. Omnidirectional vanishing shadows. He finally abandoned Feiyang Shenwang's divine body and revealed his true appearance. Moreover, his entire body lit up with dazzling divine light and instantly transformed into 9 doppelgangers. A total of 10 identical Ji Tianxing appeared in the array, each holding the sword of burial of heaven and smirking coldly. Although Ji Tianxing's doppelgangers only had half his strength, they were still quasi-emperors. Ji Tianxing's true body and one of his doppelgangers worked together to deal with the Prajna God Emperor. The other 2 doppelgangers worked together to deal with God King Crimson Dawn. As for the remaining 6 doppelgangers, they controlled the sky-sealing array and worked together to attack the fleet outside the array. The Prajna God Emperor's expression changed dramatically at this sight. Her eyes widened and she couldn't help but cry out in alarm. No! Unfortunately, the Prajna God Emperor was suppressed by Ji Tianxing and one of his doppelgangers and could no longer escape. Even God King Crimson Dawn couldn't protect her. As for God King Crimson Dawn and the 50 warships outside the array, Pan Rua God Emperor could only look on helplessly as they were surrounded and attacked by Ji Tianxing's clones, quickly dying and disintegrating. Bam! 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 Ji Tianxing's 2 doppelgangers worked together to attack God King Crimson Dawn. In less than 3 moves, God King Crimson Dawn was bleeding from her 7 orifices and fainted on the spot. Then her divine body was reduced to dust amidst a sea of sword light, nomological laws and Taoist rhymes. Her body turned into specks of divine light that dissipated into the world. God King Crimson Dawn's body had been destroyed, leaving only a cracked quintessence floating in the air. Her quintessence had been severely damaged and she had lost consciousness. The Prajna God Emperor was extremely anxious. She immediately used her arts to seize God King Crimson Dawn's quintessence. However, Ji Tianxing's doppelgangers were 1 step ahead of her and took God King Crimson Dawn's quintessence. Then the 2 doppelgangers and the other 6 doppelgangers worked together to slaughter the fleet outside the array. Rumble! Father! The sky-sealing array unleashed pillars of light that blasted the numerous warships. The 8 Ji Tianxing's doppelgangers scattered around the fleet and swung their divine swords, destroying one warship after another. Marshal Zhou, Marshal Shi, and the divine generals were all dumbfounded by the sudden appearance of Kenshin's doppelgangers. Chapter 4495. The 2 marshals and the many divine generals had thought that the one who had ambushed the Prajna God Emperor was the God Emperor of the Kongming Temple. But when the other party charged out of the sealing array and attacked them, they finally saw the face of the culprit. It was too shocking. It was that person no one had expected or imagined. Kenshin. The 2 marshals and the many god generals were dumbfounded on the spot. They simply couldn't react, nor could they understand why Kenshin, who was far away in the god realm, would appear here. Moreover, he had set up a trap here in advance to ambush the Prajna God Emperor at this critical moment. Even more frightening was the fact that Kenshin was a peak god king. How had he suddenly become a god emperor? While the 2 marshals and the divine generals were in a daze, Ji Tianxing's 8 clones had already slaughtered a large number of soldiers and divine warships. At least 3,000 soldiers were still recuperating in seclusion in their divine warships. They didn't know what was going on before they lost their lives in confusion. More than a dozen divine warships were pulverized into countless pieces of wreckage that littered the ground. Only then did the 2 marshals react. They shouted in horror and ordered the soldiers to retreat. Kenshin's clones were so powerful that they were able to deal with so many divine warships and soldiers as if they were vegetables. At such a critical juncture, the 2 marshals naturally had to preserve their strength. They could no longer be bothered to reinforce the Prajna God Emperor. Whoosh! 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 The 30-odd surviving divine warships turned around and flew south upon receiving the order. Ji Tianxing's 8 doppelgangers immediately tangled with the many divine warships and began to chase after them. The fleet hadn't gotten very far when they heard another series of rumbling and cracking sounds. Several more divine warships were smashed into smithereens, filling the sky with wreckage. Even the 1,000-odd soldiers on the divine warships were mercilessly annihilated. Most of them were reduced to ashes. As time passed, the fleet tried its best to escape, but it was unable to shake off Ji Tianxing's 8 doppelgangers. The godly warships were destroyed one after another, and the number of warships and soldiers decreased drastically. The 2 marshals and the many godly generals were scared out of their wits, and they were filled with despair. If it was any other time, they would still have hope and fantasize that the Prajna God Emperor would come and save them. But now, the Prajna God Emperor was still trapped in the ceiling formation, and he didn't know what the situation was like. The only person the fleet could rely on could not even protect himself. Who else could save them? Because of this, the 2 marshals and the many god generals felt a deep sense of despair. Soon 15 minutes passed. Ji Tianxing's 8 avatars chased after the fleet for hundreds of thousands of miles and successfully destroyed all the divine warships and soldiers. When there were only 2 divine warships left, the 2 marshals and the divine generals were in complete despair. They shouted loudly, wanting to surrender to the Kenshin. In order to survive, they had no other choice. However, Ji Tianxing's 8 clones remained silent and continued to cast spells to besiege him. Seeing that Kenshin would not accept their surrender, the 2 marshals and the many god generals were filled with grief and indignation. They could only choose to self-detonate and perish together with Kenshin's doppelgangers. Amidst the solemn atmosphere, the 2 divine warships activated their self-destructing divine formations. The 2 marshals and the many soldiers also self-destructed. Bang! Boom! 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 A series of earth-shattering booms followed by a series of explosions that reverberated through the world for hundreds of thousands of miles. One dazzling ball of divine light after another rose into the sky like mushroom clouds, unleashing destructive power that swept across the area for 100,000 miles. No one could accurately estimate the power of the self-detonation of the 2 divine warships and the many soldiers. But the area for 100,000 miles was instantly reduced to rubble, all the mountains and rivers pulverized. This area had become a barren desert. The dust and divine light that blotted out the sky persisted for a very long time before gradually dissipating. At this point, the Prajna God Emperor's fleet had been completely wiped out. The 2 marshals, several god generals, and many soldiers believed that they had died a worthy death, that they would at least be able to perish together with Kenshin's doppelgangers. But in reality, the moment they self-detonated, Ji Tianxing's 8 doppelgangers had sensed the danger and retreated ahead of time. The 8 doppelgangers instantly teleported in all directions, retreating tens of thousands of miles in the blink of an eye. When the 2 divine warships self-destructed, the power of the explosions spread out. The 8 clones had already retreated 70,000 miles away. Even though they had been swept away by the destructive shockwaves, they had been relatively far away, had been on guard, and were very strong. Thus, they had not suffered too great of an injury, only minor ones, and had successfully retreated from the area of self-detonation. Within the heaven-destroying sword formation, God King Crimson Dawn's body had been destroyed long ago, and the only thing left was his unconscious godhead, which had been taken by Ji Tianxing. The Prajna God Emperor was so furious that her face was ghastly pale. She no longer held back and began a desperate counterattack. But Ji Tianxing and another doppelganger continued to suppress her, constantly exhausting her divine power and causing her injuries to worsen. Before long, she could faintly hear a muffled boom coming from the south of the formation. She suddenly sensed something, and a hint of understanding appeared in her mind. She froze, her body somewhat stiff. She had sensed the sound of several divine warships and soldiers self-detonating. This undoubtedly meant that her fleet had been forced into a corner and could only choose to perish together with the enemy. Regardless of whether or not the self-detonation of the divine warships and soldiers could cause any damage to Kenshin's doppelgangers. The annihilation of the fleet under her command was a foregone conclusion, and it had become a part of history. Boundless rage and deep despair welled up in her heart, causing the Prajna God Emperor's face to turn even paler. She couldn't help but vomit blood. It's over. This emperor's 1,000 years of painstaking effort are all gone. This was the only thought left in the Prajna God Emperor's mind. Taking advantage of her dazed state, Ji Tianxing did not stop his attacks. He and his doppelganger attacked from both sides, unleashing several divine swords that drowned out the Prajna God Emperor's figure. Bam bam. The Prajna god emperor was unable to dodge in time and was struck by the 9 swords. The protective divine light around her body was shattered, and she was sent flying with a muffled groan. Several more wounds appeared on her body and dark red blood seeped out, soaking her dress and cloak. The wounds on her chest and shoulders were wreathed in multicolored halos that did not dissipate for a long time. Those were the wounds caused by Ji Tianxing's Dao rhyme, which left behind Dao marks. These wounds were known as Dao wounds and they were extremely difficult to heal. The appearance of Dao wounds further suppressed the Prajna god emperor's power, affecting the flow of her divine power and causing her battle prowess to drop even further. Even though she reacted and focused on resisting Ji Tianxing's attacks, it was already difficult for her to reverse the situation. Time quietly passed. Half an hour later, the Prajna god emperor's injuries were even more severe. There were as many as 16 Dao wounds on her body. At this moment, Ji Tianxing's 8 doppelgangers rushed back. Chapter 4496. Ji Tianxing's original body alone was enough to suppress the Prajna god emperor. Together with one of his clones, they were enough to injure her. One could imagine how desperate the situation of the Prajna god emperor would be when his 8 clones rushed back to join the battle. Ji Tianxing and his 9 clones joined forces to attack the Prajna god emperor, making her seem even weaker and in imminent danger. This time the Prajna god emperor was truly in despair. Ji Tianxing attacked with a cold expression, not saying a single word, his eyes cold and emotionless. The Prajna god emperor's heart was filled with boundless resentment and unwillingness, but she was unwilling to voice it out. She also pursed her lips and fought back with all her strength. But in the end she was no match for Ji Tianxing and his 9 clones. She was beaten back again and again, constantly revealing openings, her injuries becoming more and more serious. Not long ago she had told Ji Tianxing that she was an initial god emperor and was in an invincible position. Even if Ji Tianxing could suppress her, he could not defeat her, much less kill her. But now the situation was completely different and the result would also be different. Facts had proven that common sense were useless when it came to Ji Tianxing. Another quarter of an hour passed. The Prajna god emperor's injuries were extremely severe. Her body was covered in wounds and her entire body was enveloped in multicolored light. A total of 64 Dao wounds covered her entire body, completely suppressing her strength. Her forehead was covered in cold sweat, her face was as pale as paper and she began to pant in pain. Every time she circulated her divine power, every time she used a divine ability or secret art, it became more and more difficult. Her reactions became more and more sluggish and her strength grew weaker and weaker. Finally, Ji Tianxing and his 9 clones joined forces and used a joint attack sword technique, stabbing the Prajna god emperor with world-splitting sword radiances. Boom! With a deafening boom, her protective divine light completely shattered. 10 streaks of sword light pierced through her body at the same time, stabbing into her heart. Pif! Prajna god emperor's body was petrified. He froze on the spot and spat out a mouthful of blood. She had lost. In the end he was defeated by Ji Tianxing's sword. Surging Taoist rhymes flooded into her body, sealing her god body and mind and wrapping around her god head. The Prajna god emperor was completely disheartened. Filled with unwillingness and resentment, he fainted. The 9 sword lights dissipated at the same time. The Prajna god emperor also closed his eyes. His body slowly collapsed, falling into the ruins of the earth. However, Ji Tianxing used his mind to control the power of heaven and earth, condensing a pale white ripple of water to catch the unconscious Prajna god emperor. She lay quietly on the ripples, no longer making any sound. Logically speaking, she was wearing a red dress and a purple cloak. Her entire body was drenched in blood and her hair was disheveled. She should be in a sorry state and miserable state. But that was not the case. Amidst the ripples of water, even though she was lying unconscious, her posture was still graceful. The wounds on her body had not healed, but they were no longer bleeding. She was wrapped in a hazy 5-colored Taoist rhyme. The bloodstains on her body were fading away. Her entire body was enveloped in a 5-colored halo. Her cheeks were still as pale as paper, but she looked exceptionally peaceful. Whoosh! Ji Tianxing withdrew his 9 clones with a thought. Immediately the 10 clones merged and he was the only one left. He slowly walked forward, holding the sword of burial of heaven in his right hand. He walked up to the Prajna God Emperor. He looked down at the unconscious Prajna God Emperor from above. His cold face gradually relaxed, becoming calm and natural. Ever since he met the Prajna God Emperor, this was the first time he had seen the God Emperor in such a state. For some reason he did not feel any joy or excitement in defeating the Prajna God Emperor. Instead he felt somewhat conflicted. He silently gazed at the Prajna God Emperor, his mind filled with countless thoughts and memories. Looking at the 1,000-year-long experience he had with the Prajna God Emperor, the bits and pieces, everything that had happened when summed up was actually very simple. To sum it up in 4 words, it was love that gave birth to hate. Of course, that was the Prajna God Emperor's love for him. Apart from that, there was no other enmity between the two. It was also precisely because of this that even though Ji Tianqing had severely injured the Prajna God Emperor and knocked her unconscious, he did not feel the slightest sense of satisfaction or accomplishment from successfully taking revenge. After a long silence, he sighed and restrained his thoughts. His right hand slowly raised the sword of burial of heaven, pointing it at the Prajna God Emperor's forehead. That cinnabar-like red beam between her brows was still bright and beautiful. As long as he stabbed down with this sword, he would be able to pierce through her mind and shatter her divine spark. At that time the Prajna God Emperor would definitely fall and everything would come to an end. But the sword of burial of heaven remained suspended in the air. Although it did not tremble or hesitate, it did not move at all. After 10 breaths of time, Ji Tianqing sighed with a complicated expression, but in the end he still withdrew the sword of burial of heaven. His hands formed a spell, forming the heavenly Tao seal, and he sent out 81 seals that enveloped the Prajna God Emperor's body. He sealed the Prajna God Emperor, placed her in the 9th level of the 9 heavens 10 absolutes pagoda, placed her in the endless sea of flames and ignored her. Of course, he had only done this to seal the Prajna God Emperor. The Nirvana divine flame and the heaven burning flame would not burn her body in divine spark. After all, she was a God Emperor. Apart from directly destroying her divine spark, there was no other way to kill her. After sealing the Prajna God Emperor, Ji Tianqing once more used his arts to remove the heaven-destroying sword array and the heaven-sealing array. Thish. From the surrounding ruins, more than 300 divine lights flew out from the ground and gathered in front of Ji Tianqing. These were more than 300 high-grade king-level divine artifacts that he had used to set up the 2 arrays. When Ji Tianqing withdrew all the divine artifacts, the battlefield within a radius of 30,000 miles had become clear and bright. Between heaven and earth, only tens of thousands of miles of wasteland remained. He looked around, his expression indifferent, neither sad nor happy. He even felt a little lonely. He had already avenged the Prajna God Emperor. Next, he was prepared to leave the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence and seek revenge on the other 4 God Emperors. However, just as he was about to leave, he suddenly sensed something. He froze in place and slowly turned his head to the northwest. Even though at the end of his gaze, there was only a hazy, blurry shadow of a mountain range. But his divine sense could sense that at the end of the 100,000 miles, there was a faint aura. That aura was like a pair of eyes, the eyes of heaven and earth looking down on the vast earth. The previous battle as well as his actions were all clearly seen by those eyes. Ji Tianqing was on guard. He could naturally tell that the owner of that aura was definitely a God Emperor. Moreover, their strength far exceeded his, at least the middle level of the God Emperor. It's one of the temple lords of the Kongming Temple. Ji Tianqing immediately guessed the identity of that aura. The reason it was one of the temple lords was because he was sure that it was not the second temple lord. Back when he had disguised himself as Feiyang Shenwang and followed God King Qixiao and the Prajna God Emperor to 7 Moon Mountain, he had seen the second temple lord with his own eyes and could recognize his aura. 7017K. Chapter 4497. Ji Tianqing had already guessed that the Prajna God Emperor couldn't join the Kongming Temple and left in a fit of anger. If the leader of the Kongming Temple wasn't stupid, he would definitely send a God Emperor-level Temple Lord to secretly follow the Prajna God Emperor. This Temple Lord would be responsible for pacifying the 7 Moon Mountain and dealing with the follow-up matters. He would also be able to suppress the Prajna God Emperor to prevent the Prajna God Emperor from taking revenge. Since he eliminated the second Temple Lord, Ji Tianxing guessed that the first temple lord wouldn't leave the Kongming temple so easily. That left only the third temple lord, the fourth temple lord and the fifth temple lord. The fifth temple lord was the youngest and his strength was relatively weak. Ji Tianxing believed that the most suitable candidates for the Kongming temple should be the third temple lord and the fourth temple lord. Of course, according to the information he knew, both the third temple lord and the fourth temple lord were mid-level god emperor and had condensed at least 4 Taoist rhymes. Ji Tianxing was able to defeat the Prajna god emperor who had condensed 3 Taoist rhymes because he had set up a trap and ambush here more than 20 days in advance. In addition, the Prajna god emperor's strength was relatively weak and he couldn't calm down when facing him, so there were always flaws and weaknesses. All of these reasons allowed him to defeat the Prajna god emperor smoothly. However, facing the third temple lord or the fourth temple lord of the Kongming temple, he had no chance of winning at all. Not to mention, he still didn't know exactly what the hall master that was hiding in the dark had come for. In any case, the other party didn't take the initiative to show up or attack, so Ji Tianxing didn't want to bother. He didn't have anything to do with the Kongming temple, nor did he have any grudges, so there was no need to waste time. Swoosh! Ji Tianxing turned around and flew towards the southwest. He could travel 10,000 miles with a single step. However, when he turned and flew away, he sensed that the temple lord's aura was quickly approaching him. Every time the temple lord's aura flashed, he would travel 30,000 miles and teleport over. Ji Tianxing didn't know the other party's intentions, so of course he had to be vigilant and fly away quickly. He did not even hesitate to expend a large amount of divine power to teleport in the sky. Unfortunately, due to the restrictions of the Star of Origin, he could only teleport 10,000 miles away at most. As for the Hall Master who had yet to show himself, he could travel 30,000 miles with each teleportation. There was no suspense in the outcome. In a short span of 10 breaths, the Hall Master had caught up with Ji Tianxing. Shua! With a flash of divine light, the fourth Hall Master crossed 30,000 miles and appeared in front of Ji Tianxing, blocking his path. Ji Tianxing knew that his opponent's speed was much faster than his. Even if he continued to fly in another direction, he would still be caught up. Thus he simply stopped and stood in the sky. He maintained a distance of 1,000 miles from the other party and looked at him expressionlessly. The fourth Hall Master was a living being of the desolate race. He was more than 10 feet tall and his body was well-proportioned and thin. His body was covered in dark golden scales, like a snake or a dragon. His shoulders were wide and his facial features were deep. There was a protruding horn on his forehead that looked like a diamond-shaped golden stone. It shimmered with a dark red glow. He was dressed in a dark purple gorgeous robe and wore a crown on his head. There was a 2-foot-long dagger hanging from his waist. Such obvious characteristics made it easy for people to recognize him. Ji Tianxing stared at him indifferently and took the initiative to ask, "Which Hall Master of the Kongming Temple are you?" The fourth Hall Master pricked up his eyebrows and his lips curled into a playful smile. He answered, "This emperor is ranked 4th and is the 4th Hall Master that everyone speaks of. Since you have already guessed this emperor's identity, I believe you should know why this emperor is here." Ji Tianxing frowned and said in an indifferent tone, "How would this emperor know what 4th Hall's intentions are?" This time it was the 4th Hall Master's turn to frown. The smile on his lips turned into a sneer. He said, "Originally, the Pan-Ri God Emperor and her fleet joining our Kongming Temple was already set in stone. Who knew that there would be an accident midway, resulting in today's situation? If this emperor did not guess wrongly, this should be your doing, right?" Ji Tianxing did not show it on the surface, but he was secretly surprised. The 4th Hall Master had been hiding in the distance, secretly observing the battle. Logically speaking, it was impossible for the 4th Hall Master to know the inside story. At most, he would think that he had a grudge with the Pan-Ri God Emperor and had deliberately ambushed the Pan-Ri God Emperor. But he did not expect that the Pan-Ri God Emperor would be able to guess the inside story with just a few clues. It was truly shocking. Ji Tianxing said without changing his expression, "4th Hall Master misunderstood. This emperor only had a grudge with the Pan-Ri God Emperor and had set up an ambush to kill her. As for the Pan-Ri fleet and the Kongming Temple, this emperor did not know about it and had never interfered." The sneer on the 4th Hall Master's face became even more pronounced. He said in a mocking tone, "Ha! It's useless even if you deny it." You only feel that you have caused the deaths of so many people of the Seven Moon Mountain and the destruction of the Pan-Ri fleet. You have ruined this hall's plans and are afraid of this hall's revenge. But the truth is that this emperor has appeared and did not attack you. I can even say so much to you. This proves that you do not need to worry. Ji Tianxing followed his words and continued, since Fourth Hall Master does not plan to make things difficult for this emperor, then forgive this emperor for not being able to accompany you. I will take my leave first. Sigh. Seeing that he was about to leave, the Fourth Hall Master took a step forward and extended his hand to block his path. He said with a smile, from the moment I saw you, this emperor felt that you and this hall were fated. Although your scheme caused the deaths of more than 10,000 people of the Seven Moon Mountain and the destruction of the Pan-Ri fleet and ruined this hall's plans. But this emperor can promise you that this hall will not pursue your crimes. Not only that, this hall has always been benevolent and generous. We are willing to take in the elites of all races and nurture the heroes of the world. Especially for a talent like you, this hall is thirsty for talent. Actually, Ji Tianxing had already guessed the Fourth Hall Master's intentions when he did not make a move and did not mention the matter of taking revenge for the Qingyu Hall. He did not expect that he was right. The Fourth Hall Master actually wanted to recruit him into the Kongming Temple. Without waiting for the Fourth Hall Master to finish speaking, Ji Tianxing waved his hand and interrupted him, saying, Fourth Hall Master, you misunderstand. This emperor's talent is mediocre and does not have any fate with the Kongming Temple. Fourth Hall Master, please do not waste time on this emperor. This emperor has already made up his mind. Also, if Fourth Hall Master is worried that this emperor's activities here will threaten the Kongming Temple's interests, then this emperor will leave and will never appear in the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence again. Ji Tianxing had already seen that the Kongming Temple appeared to be benevolent and virtuous on the surface and seemed to be pure. In reality, the Kongming Temple did not lack schemes and all kinds of tyrannical methods. He did not want to tangle with the Kongming Temple, so he decisively refused. However, the Fourth Hall Master would not let him go so easily. He chuckled and said, Your talent is mediocre? A mere God Emperor initial stage cultivator who has only condensed one Taoist rhyme was actually able to defeat the Pan-Ri God Emperor who has condensed 3 Taoist rhymes. You alone used schemes and tricks to not only ruin the plans of the Pan-Ri God Emperor and this hall, but also destroy the entire Pan-Ri fleet. Young man, if your talent is mediocre, then there are no geniuses in this world. Chapter 4498. Originally, Ji Tianxing thought that the Kongming Temple had gone to great lengths to get the Prajna God Emperor and her fleet to join them in order to expand their influence. After all, there were several temple forces on the planet of origin, and there might be competition and conflict between them. Not only the Kongming Temple but every temple might be thinking of ways to increase their influence. But now, the Prajna God Emperor had been defeated and sealed, and the Prajna fleet had been completely wiped out. Not only did the Fourth Temple Master not deal with the main culprit, but he also had the intention of subduing him. This made Ji Tianxing wonder if the Kongming Temple had first taken in the Prajna God Emperor, and now wanted to subdue him. Was it to expand their influence or did they have other motives? Thinking of this, Ji Tianxing did not hide and asked directly, the Kongming Temple subduing the Prajna God Emperor is easy to understand. After all, the Prajna God Emperor's strength is not ordinary, and she has 100,000 soldiers under her command. They have very strong fighting power. But I am alone. I wonder why the Fourth Temple Master has invited me to join the Kongming Temple? After thinking about it, I can't be of much use to the Kongming Temple, right? The Fourth Temple Master chuckled and said, Since you have thought of this question, it means that we have the possibility of reaching a consensus. Although the Prajna God Emperor and her fleet are indeed my #1 target. But I did not take her in just to expand my influence. In my eyes, a monstrous genius like you is far more important than her and her fleet. Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows and looked calmly at the Fourth Temple Master. He said, But you still haven't told me why you invited me to join the Kongming Temple? The Fourth Temple Master knew that an expert like Ji Tianxing was very scheming and shrewd, and it was impossible to gain his trust with a few words. Instead of boasting, it was better to be honest and direct. Perhaps it would be more effective. Thinking of this, the Fourth Palace Master stopped smiling and said seriously, To be honest, I have been looking for creatures with outstanding talent regardless of race. As long as it was a genius with extraordinary talent, it would be possible to help the Kongming Temple. As for what you can help me with and why you can help me, I can't answer that question. Only after you join the Kongming Temple will these secrets be revealed to you. Of course, you will be treated the same as the Prajna God Emperor. The temple will confer you the title of Sixth Hall Master. There was no doubt that the Fourth Palace Master's words and attitude were sincere. He also sincerely wanted Ji Tianxing to join the Kongming Temple. Ji Tianxing also believed that what the Fourth Palace Master said was true. But he just wanted to know what kind of problem the Kongming Temple was facing that they needed help. The secret mentioned by the Fourth Palace Master seemed to be somewhat mysterious and important, which also interested him. But the Fourth Palace Master said that if he wanted to know these secrets, he had to join the Kongming Temple. Therefore, Ji Tianxing would rather not explore these secrets and problems than join the Kongming Temple. Sorry, since you are not willing to tell me the reason, I can only assume that you are not sincere. An invitation without sincerity is naturally not attractive at all. Ji Tianxing believed that the Fourth Palace Master would keep the secret and would not easily reveal it, so he used this as an excuse to reject him. Sure enough, the Fourth Palace Master's face was a little gloomy, and his eyes flashed with cold light. I've already shown you enough sincerity and promised you the corresponding status and treatment. But I didn't expect you to be so stubborn. It seems that you don't take me seriously. Ji Tianxing's lips curled into a cold smile as he said, "What? If the soft approach doesn't work, you use the hard approach. If the negotiation doesn't work, you want to fight? You finally show your true colors?" The Fourth Palace Master snorted coldly, and his whole body surged with a power that could shake the heavens and earth, as well as a surging pressure. "You are the one who refused a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. I gave you face but you didn't want it. Since this is the case, I can only defeat you and take you back to the temple." As the Fourth Palace Master's voice fell, endless divine power surged out of his body and spread in all directions, connecting hundreds of thousands of miles of heaven and earth. Suddenly, his robe fluttered and the surrounding tens of thousands of miles of heaven and earth were blown up. The majestic divine power of heaven and earth quickly condensed and increased in power, forming an invisible giant hand and fiercely suppressing Ji Tianxing. The Fourth Palace Master was confident of his status and would not draw his sword right away. Instead, he first displayed the power of the middle level of the God Emperor to intimidate Ji Tianxing and force him to admit defeat. Even though the Fourth Palace Master said that Ji Tianxing was the only one he had seen in his life, and could be called a monstrous genius. But in reality he still underestimated Ji Tianxing's strength. From the beginning, Ji Tianxing had made up his mind not to fight the Fourth Palace Master to the death, but to find a way to get rid of him. So, on the surface he was negotiating with the Fourth Palace Master, but in reality he was stalling for time and secretly accumulating power. When the Fourth Palace Master controlled the divine power of heaven and earth and accumulated a huge amount of divine power of heaven and earth to suppress him, he turned and fled without hesitation. So close yet so far. Forced by the situation, Ji Tianxing used the power that he had accumulated to the peak and borrowed the power of heaven and earth to use a divine power secret technique that he had recently developed. Ever since he returned the Five Elements world to its original position and the three stars returned to their original positions, not only did he break through to the God Emperor realm, but his body also underwent a huge change. The most intuitive feeling was that he could easily merge with any star in the world. Secondly, he could smoothly use the power of heaven and earth to unleash power that far exceeded those of the same level. This divine power, called so close, yet so far, was a concealment technique that he had recently developed. When this technique was used, he could instantly change his position and borrow the power of heaven and earth to teleport. The shortest distance was 80,000 to 100,000 miles, and the longest distance was hundreds of thousands of miles. On the surface, it sounded very similar to the teleportation that the God Kings were used to. But teleportation relied on the divine power of space. The space on the Star of Origin was too firm, and God Kings could not teleport here. Only the God Emperor could do it, and there was a limit to the distance. Ji Tianxing's self-created move so close yet so far was different. He did not borrow the power of space, but used a method similar to burrowing underground to teleport 100,000 miles away in an instant. Swish. Before the Fourth Palace Master's accumulated divine power of heaven and earth descended, Ji Tianxing's body flashed with golden light and disappeared from the spot. The next moment he appeared on a mountain peak 100,000 miles away. The fourth palace master, who was full of confidence and majesty just a moment ago, was dumbfounded. He could not believe his eyes. An initial god emperor who had condensed one Taoist rhyme could teleport 100,000 miles away. Even he, an expert in the middle god emperor realm, could not do it. This was too unbelievable. The fourth palace master was stunned for a moment. His heart was filled with shock and his eyes widened. However, he quickly reacted and suppressed his shock. He hurriedly teleported to chase after Ji Tianxing. While he was teleporting, he was thinking to himself, I didn't see wrongly. This lad is indeed a one-in-a-million peerless genius. No matter what, I will make him work for the temple. Chapter 4499. Ji Tianxing had defeated the Prajna god emperor and destroyed the Prajna fleet. Now he had shown such amazing talent and means, which shocked the fourth palace master even more. At the same time, the fourth palace master was even more determined to bring Ji Tianxing back to the Kongming temple, even if he had to be tied up. The people that the Kongming temple was looking for should be extraordinary, exceptional and outstanding. Previously, the Kongming temple had recruited the Prajna god emperor and the Prajna fleet because the Kongming temple wanted to see if the Prajna god emperor was a suitable candidate. Also, the Kongming temple was willing to spend more time to find a target from the 100,000 soldiers of the Prajna fleet. But Ji Tianxing's appearance made the fourth palace master feel that the Prajna god emperor and his 100,000 soldiers were not very valuable. Compared to Ji Tianxing, the Prajna god emperor and his 100,000 soldiers were not the target they were looking for. Only Ji Tianxing met their criteria. Swoosh, swoosh. The fourth palace master quickly teleported in the sky, and every time his figure flashed he would cross 30,000 miles, chasing after Ji Tianxing. Although Ji Tianxing had used Imminent Skyline to open up a distance of 100,000 miles, he had used Imminent Skyline. But he had used Imminent Skyline once, which consumed a lot of his divine power, and he could not use it again in a short period of time. Moreover, the fourth palace master's teleportation speed was faster than his. As time passed, the distance between the two narrowed. If the situation continued, the fourth palace master would soon catch up with him. Soon 20 breaths of time passed. The fourth palace master gradually caught up with Ji Tianxing, and the distance between the two was less than 1,000 miles. The fourth palace master was about to attack and use his secret technique again. Even if he could not hurt Ji Tianxing, he had to slow him down and make him stay. At the critical moment, Ji Tianxing once again unleashed his power and used Imminent Skyline. Swoosh. With a flash of divine light, Ji Tianxing disappeared on the spot. In the next instant he teleported another 100,000 miles away and appeared 100,000 miles away in the south. The fourth palace master frowned as a cold light flashed in his eyes. His face became even more serious. Ji Tianxing being able to execute so close, yet poles apart once was already out of his expectations. Now Ji Tianxing was able to perform this divine ability twice in a short span of 20 breaths. This was beyond the fourth hall master's expectations. This also allowed him to see Ji Tianxing's endless potential and talent. This emperor is already 60 to 70% sure. Perhaps the person our Kongming temple is looking for is a monster like him. The fourth palace master was not sure if Ji Tianxing was the person they were looking for. However, he was certain that the gifted and peerless genius that the Kongming temple was looking for must be someone like Ji Tianxing. Therefore he continued to maintain his speed of 30,000 miles per step and chased after Ji Tianxing to the south. At the same time he did not forget to take out his communication jade slip and reply to the first palace master. The content of the message was very simple. First he reported the whereabouts of the Prajna god emperor and his fleet. Then he focused on describing Ji Tianxing. In fact, after the fourth palace master arrived at Mount Seven Moons, he did not show up at all. He did not make any deployment or arrangements before leaving Mount Seven Moons. He had been secretly following the Prajna fleet, hoping to see the Prajna god emperor return to the fleet before returning to Mount Seven Moons to make his deployment. However, he did not expect to be pleasantly surprised. He actually saw Ji Tianxing ambushing the Prajna god emperor along the way. Therefore, in his report to the first palace master, the content of Mount Seven Moons was very brief. The main content was to describe Ji Tianxing's monstrous talent. The fourth palace master believed that after the first palace master read the message, he would definitely attach great importance to Ji Tianxing. He would definitely send more experts to assist him and capture Ji Tianxing back to the Kongming Temple. Soon the two of them chased for another 30 breaths of time. The two of them had already flown 1,000,000 miles away, far away from the previous battlefield. When Ji Tianxing was flying over a forest, the fourth palace master caught up with him again. He was only 1,000 miles away from him. This time the fourth palace master was full of anticipation. He wanted to see if Ji Tianxing could use Close It Worlds Apart a third time. If Ji Tianxing's performance was even more monstrous, he would be certain that Ji Tianxing might be the person the Kongming Temple was looking for. However, Ji Tianxing had already used Close It Worlds Apart twice in a row. He had used up a lot of his divine power and his divine body had reached its limit. If he used Close It Worlds Apart again, he could still barely use it. However, his divine body and godhead would not have any buffer space and would definitely be damaged. He knew very well that it would be very difficult to get rid of the fourth palace master. Next, there would probably be a fierce battle between the two of them to get out of this predicament. Therefore, Ji Tianxing did not use Close It Worlds Apart again. Instead, he stopped decisively and used absolute shadows to surround the fourth palace master. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. A dazzling divine light flashed and 9 doppelgangers appeared. Together with Ji Tianxing's original body, there were a total of 10 figures scattered in the sky and formed an encirclement. Without any superfluous words, Ji Tianxing and his 9 doppelgangers cast spells at the same time and formed a battle formation. They controlled the power of heaven and earth to suppress the fourth palace master. Moreover, the 10 figures used absolute swordsmanship skills at the same time and drowned the fourth palace master's figure with sword light that filled the sky. The fourth palace master had expected that Ji Tianxing would not be able to escape from his grasp and would definitely be forced to stop fighting. However, he did not expect Ji Tianxing to have such a trick up his sleeve. He could actually create 9 doppelgangers and fight together with him. The 9 doppelgangers were exactly the same and had half of the original body's strength. This was simply unbelievable. Originally, it was Ji Tianxing fighting the fourth palace master alone. In this way, it was equivalent to 5 of him fighting together. While the fourth palace master was casting mysterious spells and using the power of heaven and earth to resist Ji Tianxing's encirclement, he thought to himself, the doppelganger technique is very common and is usually only used by divine gods and divine emperors. After reaching the divine king realm, everyone would try to refine doppelgangers. For someone like him who has cultivated the doppelganger technique to the extreme, there is actually another use. He can increase his combat power by several times. This man is indeed monstrous. I have to take him seriously. Otherwise, I might really fail miserably and let him escape. Ji Tianxing's various performances made the fourth palace master more cautious when dealing with him. Previously, the fourth palace master thought that using 60 to 70% of his power would be enough to defeat Ji Tianxing. But now it seemed that he could not be careless. He still had to use his full strength. Bang! 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 The absolute swordsmanship used by the two sides collided fiercely in the sky. There was a deafening sound and a shockwave that could destroy heaven and earth. Countless divine light fragments with a terrifying impact spread in all directions and razed the surrounding mountains and rivers to the ground. In the first 10 moves, Ji Tianxing and the 9 doppelgangers attacked and retreated together. The absolute swordsmanship that they used was the same. The power was indeed very strong. However, he found a flaw. The fourth palace master's strength was very strong and his insight was very strong. He quickly saw the flaw and found a way to deal with it. Chapter 4500. Ji Tianxing had always thought that the Star of Origin had been peaceful for tens of thousands of years. The experts of the various temples rarely had the chance to engage in a large-scale battle. They all lacked combat experience. In fact, it was true, especially the Sir Gods and King Gods of the Divine Halls. They were indeed lacking in battle experience. However, for a God Emperor like the Fourth Hall Master, battle experience did not have much of an impact on the outcome. In particular, the Fourth Hall Master had the advantage of suppressing him in terms of cultivation level, which reduced the impact of his lack of battle experience even more. He and the Fourth Hall Master had exchanged 10 moves, but they were still unable to defeat the Fourth Hall Master. It was a tie. Therefore, Ji Tianxing decisively changed his strategy. He was multitasking. His original body performed various divine powers and secret skills while his 9 doppelgangers performed different sword principle unique skills at the same time. Suddenly the battle scene became even more dazzling. Hundreds of divine powers and secret skills emerged one after another. It was too much for the eyes to take in. The 4th Hall Master was obviously stunned for a moment. Then his eyes lit up with surprise and joy. The more extraordinary Ji Tianqing's performance was, the more amazing his talent was, the more excited he was. Because he was more and more certain that Ji Tianqing was the target they were looking for. Of course, despite his excitement, the 4th Hall Master did not let his guard down. He became even more cautious. Sky-bearing form rise. The 4th Hall Master did not use any divine weapons. He only used his hands to perform a spell to control the divine power of heaven and earth and release various divine path unique skills. Under his control, the endless divine power of heaven and earth merged with the pressure of heaven way to form various sword shadows, wind, fire, and lightning that continuously attacked Ji Tianqing. The sword principle divine powers that the 9 doppelgangers performed were all defeated by the 4th Hall Master. They turned into endless divine light fragments and scattered between heaven and earth. Even the divine powers and secret skills performed by Ji Tianqing's original body were quickly dissolved by the 4th Hall Master and dissipated between heaven and earth. As time passed, the two of them exchanged more and more moves. The 4th Hall Master also had a better understanding of Ji Tianqing's battle style and divine powers and secret skills. He fought 1 against 10, but he was always methodical and did not panic at all. No matter how Ji Tianqing changed his battle formation and used various divine powers and secret skills, he could not defeat the 4th Hall Master. After an hour, Ji Tianqing and the 4th Hall Master had exchanged thousands of moves. Apart from a few secret skills of divine powers and secret skills, he had used almost all of his divine powers. In the end, he and his 9 doppelgangers had exhausted a large amount of divine power, but the 4th Palace Master was still safe and sound. Ji Tianqing was anxious. He knew that he could not delay any longer. Otherwise, not only would he not be able to defeat the 4th Palace Master, he would also be dragged down by the 4th Palace Master. In terms of strength, foundation, divine power and control of the power of heaven and earth, he was indeed inferior to the 4th Hall Master. He of heaven 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 to he too of God of heaven 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 of heaven 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 of heaven and earth. He had always been good at both offense and defense. While he was in an invincible position, he was constantly pressuring the Ji Tianqing clan. He was not in a hurry to defeat Ji Tianqing. He would rather stall for time even if he had to fight for 3 days and 3 nights. Because he wanted to see how much potential Ji Tianqing had that had not been stimulated, how many trump cards and tricks he had, and how many surprises he could bring him. Taking a step back, even if he couldn't defeat Ji Tianqing quickly, he could still use his nearly limitless divine power to drag Ji Tianqing to the point of exhaustion. At that time, Ji Tianqing would be at his mercy. Moreover, this was the territory of the Kongming Temple. The 4th Hall Master had already reported the news to the 1st Hall Master. He believed that the temple would soon send more experts to support. Even if there was an accident in the fight between him and Ji Tianqing escaped temporarily, he did not have to worry. All in all, the 4th Hall Master was in an invincible position and had complete control of the situation. Ji Tianqing had not been defeated yet, but he and his 9 doppelgangers could not hold on for too long. He had to make changes and respond quickly before his power weakened. Therefore he used his Taoist rhyme and borrowed the divine power of Heaven Wei to launch his strongest attack on the 4th Hall Master. Rising Dragon Slash. Ji Tianqing held the Sword of Burial of Heaven with both hands and activated the Taoist rhyme that he had accumulated throughout his life. He slashed out a giant 5-colored sword that was 10,000 feet long. This sword contained thousands of great Tao precepts and endless divine power of Heaven Wei. The 9 doppelgangers cooperated with him and used their sword Tao superpower to block the 4th Hall Master. The 4th Hall Master could not dodge and could only face this dazzling giant sword head-on. Although the 4th Hall Master was very powerful, he felt threatened by this giant 5-colored sword. If he did not block and resolve it, he would be severely injured after being hit by the giant 5-colored sword. At this critical moment, the 4th Hall Master did not dare to be careless. He decisively chose to use his natal divine weapon. Zhou. He raised his eyebrows and the diamond-shaped golden horn on his forehead shone with golden light. It quickly separated from his body and turned into a 3-feet-tall bell that floated above his head. The dark golden bell had a simple and unadorned design. It contained an ancient and boundless aura and a rich divine power of heaven way. Facing this bell was like facing a god emperor. It was more like seeing the messenger and incarnation of the heavenly way. The bell was only a divine weapon, but it was an emperor-level divine weapon that could replace the divine power of heaven way. This was the 4th Hall Master's natal divine weapon, the celestial bell that he had nurtured for more than 20,000 years. Under the 4th Hall Master's control, the celestial bell suddenly expanded to a radius of 10 feet. It shone with a sacred golden light and enveloped him. At this moment, the 4th Hall Master's figure appeared very tall and majestic. In the next moment, the giant 5-colored sword that could split heaven and earth struck the celestial bell. There was an earth-shattering sound that shook the heavens and the earth. Ji Tianxing's pupils shrank as a shocking scene appeared. The celestial bell did not move at all. The sacred golden light shield was also unscathed. As for the 4th Hall Master who was protected by the celestial bell, he was unscathed. One of Ji Tianxing's most powerful killing moves could not even shake the 4th Hall Master's natal divine weapon. This was one of the reasons why the 4th Hall Master was invincible. Rumble. In the dull sound, the giant 5-colored sword that was tens of thousands of feet long broke into several pieces. However, it still cut through the sky and tore a huge black gap. That black gap that was thousands of miles long was the spatial crack that lay between Ji Tianxing and the 4th Hall Master. The 4th Hall Master stood where he was unscathed and did not move an inch. Ji Tianxing, on the other hand, was blasted away by the powerful recoil and flew tens of thousands of miles away. Of course, he did not expect this divine skill to hurt the 4th Hall Master. He took the opportunity to turn around and escape. He also recalled his 9 doppelgangers. Thus, the battle between the two of them stopped. Then it became Ji Tianxing running in front while the 4th Hall Master chased after him at a moderate pace. Chapter 4501. While the 4th Hall Master was hunting down Ji Tianxing, the 4th Hall Master's message Jade Slip returned to the Kongming Temple and fell into the hands of the 1st Hall Master. Half a day ago, the 4th Hall Master sent a message to the 1st Hall Master, reporting that he had arrived at the 7 Moon Mountain and was ready to take over the Qingyu Hall's affairs. After reading the message Jade Slip, the 1st Hall Master told the other Hall Masters that the 4th Hall Master had arrived at the 7 Moon Mountain. The other Hall Masters were waiting for the next news, wanting to see how the 4th Hall Master would deal with the Qingyu Hall and the Prajna God Emperor. Half a day later, the 4th Hall Master sent back a message. However, the 1st Hall Master's expression changed immediately after reading the message, and his eyes flashed with a dazzling light. Obviously, the 1st Hall Master did not expect that a primordial God Emperor would appear out of nowhere. Moreover, it was the primordial God Emperor who had schemed to sow discord between the Qingyu Hall and the Prajna God Emperor, which had led to this war. Not only had the Kongming Temple's plan been foiled, but the Qingyu Hall and the Prajna fleet had also suffered heavy losses. In the end, the primordial God Emperor had even set up an ambush for the Prajna God Emperor and destroyed the Prajna fleet. Without the 4th Hall Master's reminder, the 1st Hall Master had immediately realized that the primordial God Emperor was a monster and a very dangerous person. Moreover, the 4th Hall Master had given a detailed description of the primordial God Emperor. The 1st Hall Master agreed with the 4th Hall Master's words and actions. No matter what, they had to bring the primordial God Emperor into the Kongming Temple. The 2nd Hall Master, the 3rd Hall Master and the 5th Hall Master also knew that the 4th Hall Master had sent back a message, but the 1st Hall Master did not respond. Therefore, the 3 Hall Masters released their divine senses at the same time to communicate with the 1st Hall Master and ask about the situation. 1st Hall Master, what did the 4th Hall Master say in the message just sent back? 4th brother has already arrived at 7 Moon Mountain. It's only been half a day and he's already finished dealing with the matters of Qingyu Hall? Qingyu Hall's affairs are simple. The key is, did the Prajna God Emperor return to the fleet as promised and leave with her fleet? Given the Prajna God Emperor's temperament, I'm afraid he won't be willing to leave and will most likely seek revenge. I think the 4th Palace Master's message is most likely related to this matter. The other Palace Masters asked the 1st Palace Master what had happened, and they all expressed their worries. The first palace master did not hide anything from everyone. He told the 3 palace masters about the contents of the communication jade slip. After the 3 hall masters heard the story, they were filled with excitement and disbelief. At the same time they were also excited. There was no need for the first hall master to comment, as the 3 hall masters could not help but discuss. No wonder the Qingyu Hall and the Prajna fleet had a conflict and eventually reached the point of no return. So it was the primordial god emperor's plot. The primordial god emperor had a grudge against the Prajna god emperor, but he was able to endure it and use the Qingyu Hall to take revenge on the Prajna fleet. He's really insidious and cunning. He's just an initial god emperor with only 1 Taoist connotation, but he defeated the Prajna god emperor with 3 Taoist connotations and escaped from the 4th palace master's hands. It's incredible. The primordial god emperor is not only extraordinarily talented, but also has profound shrewdness and wisdom. He's indeed a rare genius. Although that guy ruined our plan and caused great losses to the Qingyu Hall, I agree with the 4th palace master's decision. We can't kill that guy. No matter what, we have to bring that guy back to the temple and use him for our own use. If our analysis and judgment are correct, that primordial god emperor is very likely the person we're looking for. That's right. Previously we tried our best to win over the Prajna god emperor because we saw the Prajna god emperor's talent and aptitude. Together with the 100,000 soldiers under her command, we might be able to cultivate a peerless genius in the future. But now it seems that the Prajna god emperor and her soldiers are far inferior to this primordial god emperor. First hall master. This emperor is willing to lead elite experts to support the 4th palace master and pursue that primordial god emperor. That guy is too cunning. It's better for us to split up and work together. It's safer. The hall masters discussed for a while and quickly reached a consensus. They all wanted to lead troops to surround Zhi Tianxing. The first hall master weighed the pros and cons for a while before finally making a decision and issuing the order. The 3 of you each take 1,000 Divine King Realm Guards and split up into 3 groups to support the 4th palace master. This emperor only has one request. You must capture that guy. Furthermore, you must capture him alive. The 3 hall masters' spirits were shaken. They complied without hesitation. Subsequently, the 3 hall masters did not delay any longer. They all went to gather the troops and started the operation. In less than 15 minutes, the 3 hall masters were all ready. They each led 1,000 elites and left the Kongming mystic realm one after another. They all boarded the divine ship and rushed south at the fastest speed. While flying and hurrying, the 3 hall masters did not forget to contact the 4th palace master to inquire about his location and movements. Zhi Tianxing and the 4th palace master's pursuit in the vast heaven and earth continued for half a day without ending. The 4th palace master's speed of teleportation was much faster than Zhi Tianxing's. Therefore, every once in a while the 4th palace master could catch up with Zhi Tianxing and unleash a fierce attack on him. And Zhi Tianxing could always change his tricks and use all kinds of magical abilities and methods to shake off the 4th palace master's suppression. In this half a day's time, both sides clashed 9 times. Although Zhi Tianxing could not shake off the 4th palace master's pursuit from beginning to end, he also had a deeper understanding of the 4th palace master's strength realm. He already accurately grasped that the 4th palace master was at the middle stage of the God Emperor realm. He had condensed 4 Dao runes. As for the divine Dao laws that the 4th palace master grasped, the number was around 1,500. Zhi Tianxing only condensed 1 Dao rune. But he could last so long under the 4th palace master's hands. It was because he grasped 1,800 kinds of divine Dao laws. Ever since he broke through to the God Emperor realm, he would have new comprehensions every once in a while. His perception of heaven and earth would become deeper, and he comprehended even more divine Dao laws. He calculated in his heart that if he could condense another Dao rune, even if it was only 2 Dao runes, he could contend with the 4th palace master and not fall into a disadvantage. Or perhaps if he could grasp 2,000 kinds of divine Dao laws, he would also have a chance to shake off the 4th palace master's pursuit. Unfortunately, these 2 conditions could not be achieved in a short period of time. In addition, the Sword of Burial of Heaven was only a Supreme King-level divine weapon, while the 4th palace master's Celestial Globe Bell was a genuine Emperor-level divine weapon. This was also one of the factors that widened the gap between the two. If it was not for Ji Tianxing's extraordinary talent that allowed him to easily merge with heaven, earth and stars, and was not suppressed by the divine might of the heavens, he would have been defeated by the fourth palace master long ago. Even so, after continuously chasing and fleeing for half a day, he was exhausted, and his divine power was greatly depleted. On the other hand, the fourth palace master was still unhurried and methodical, and he had a well-thought-out attitude. In his eyes, Ji Tianxing was already a turtle in a jar and could not escape even if he had wings. Chapter 4502. The fourth palace master was not in a hurry because he was confident that he could suppress Ji Tianxing. Moreover, he had just received news that the first palace master had sent out 3 palace masters, each leading 1,000 elites to reinforce him. Although the fourth palace master had guessed that the 3 palace masters might want to take the credit, it was not important. They could surround Ji Tianxing from different directions and cut off Ji Tianxing's escape route. That was the most important thing. It was evening and the sky was dark. Ji Tianxing was flying over a misty lake, and the fourth palace master was following closely behind him. They were less than 1,000 miles apart. The fourth palace master was about to use his divine skill again to attack Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing had been running for half a day and he was exhausted. His face was pale. He had used up too much of his divine power, and he only had about 70% of his combat power left. He was gradually weakening. He knew that he could not delay any longer with the fourth palace master. He had to show enough determination to get rid of the fourth palace master completely. Therefore, before the fourth palace master attacked, he decisively opened the space tunnel to Jiutian 10 Absolute's tower. Swoosh, swoosh. In the next moment, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Bai Feng, Yang and the others turned into divine lights and flew out. Other than Yun Yao and Ji Ku, who were peak divine kings, the other 22 were all upper divine kings. Among the 22 upper divine kings, there were his friends and family, and there were also followers from the god realm. When they appeared in the sky, they instantly formed a battle formation and joined forces to attack the fourth palace master. At the same time, Ji Tianxing also used the 10 directional vanishing shadows to create 9 clones and joined forces with the others to attack the fourth palace master. Previously, when he fought against the Prajna god emperor, destroyed the Prajna fleet, and was chased by the fourth palace master, he was still alone. In fact, Yun Yao and Ji Ku already knew about his situation. They had been worried about his safety and wanted to fight alongside him several times. However, he was worried about everyone's safety, so he never agreed. After all, this was a battle between god-emperor powerhouses. It would be extremely dangerous for god-kings like them to participate. The slightest carelessness could cost them their lives. But things were different now. Ji Tianxing was unable to get rid of the fourth palace master. He had to decisively deal a heavy blow to the fourth palace master in order to have a chance to get rid of him. Everyone joined forces with him to fight. They had already discussed a strategy and formed the 9 Suns heaven-burning battle formation with great tacit understanding. Ji Tianxing was the killing machine of the battle formation. Everyone helped him gather strength and enhance his power at all costs. At the same time, he also used the ultimate skill of the celestial dragon tyrant body. He turned into a golden giant that was tens of thousands of feet tall and attacked the fourth palace master in the most ferocious way. The celestial dragon tyrant body increased his combat power by 8 times and could last for an hour. With everyone joining forces to form a formation, his battle prowess was doubled. In other words, he was currently in his strongest state, where his combat power was increased by 10 times. If he still could not defeat the fourth hall master, then he did not have much hope. Sword breaking the 9 heavens. Ji Tianxing, who was tens of thousands of feet tall, held the giant burial of heaven sword with both hands. He roared and slashed out a giant sword that was hundreds of miles long. This sword was extremely violent. It even contained 1,200 types of laws and divine power, as well as Ji Tianxing's condensed Taoist rhyme. The fourth palace master was stunned for a moment. His pupils constricted as shock flashed across his eyes. He had always thought that Ji Tianxing acted alone without any followers or partners. After all, Ji Tianxing did not have any partners when he fought against the Hanya fleet previously. He did not expect that 24 God King powerhouses would suddenly appear beside him and form a formation with such tacit understanding. Even though the 24 God King powerhouses could not pose a threat to the fourth palace master. Even the two peak divine kings with the strongest strength could not possibly injure him either. But the 24 God Kings joined forces and helped Ji Tianxing greatly increase his combat power. At this moment, the fourth palace master also felt a great threat, and a warning sign appeared in his heart. He stopped in his tracks without hesitation and took out the armillary bell to protect himself. He waved his hands and formed hand seals, creating a sky full of sword and saber light. Kaboom! In the next moment, a deafening loud noise exploded. Ji Tianxing's giant sword slashed through the sky full of sword and saber light and slashed the armillary bell that was flickering with divine light. The outcome was not surprising. The Emperor-level divine artifact armillary bell actually had its divine light shattered, and a deep dent was left on the bell. The violent and unparalleled power sent the armillary bell flying tens of thousands of miles away, crashing into the edge of the huge lake. Suddenly, the dozens of mountain peaks by the lake were destroyed within a radius of 20,000 miles. The lake's surface stirred up huge waves. The surging lake water quickly flooded the ruins within 20,000 miles, causing the lake's surface to expand. After the armillary bell was sent flying, it was damaged and could not return to the fourth palace master's hands in a short period of time. The fourth palace master was shocked and could only find it hard to believe. He stared at Ji Tianxing with his eyes wide open. If he had not experienced it himself, he would never have believed that the other party, with the strength of an initial god emperor, could damage his natal divine artifact. But Ji Tianxing did not give him a chance to think, sigh, or take back the armillary bell. Without any pause, Ji Tianxing swung the Sword of Burial of Heaven and used the second divine power. Sword of Apocalypse. As he roared, he crazily absorbed the power of the five elements world. With the most powerful world power, mixed with the divine power of 1,200 laws in his Taoist rhymes, he slashed with the sword. Although he was on the planet of origin and the five elements world was far away in the void of the universe, he had already merged with the five elements world. However, he had long since merged with the five elements world. The two coexisted and their powers could be used together. This did not make sense and even went against the rules of the heavenly way. But for some reason this was the reality, and the heavenly way did not seem to have any abnormalities. Swoosh! The Sword of Apocalypse that condensed Ji Tianxing's most powerful power was the most powerful killing move that he had created by comprehending the heaven punishment array. At this moment, Ji Tianxing's combat power had reached its peak. The sword strike he had unleashed could be said to be the strongest strike of his life. The 100-mile-long Sword of Apocalypse shone with dazzling five-colored divine light. It locked on to the fourth palace master and also sealed the surrounding space. The fourth palace master was shocked and felt a strong sense of death. But he could not teleport or retreat in time. Without the protection of the armillary bell, he panicked. Seeing the Sword of Apocalypse descending from the sky, he could only take out a dozen Supreme King-level divine artifacts. They surrounded him and emitted the most dazzling light. Those divine artifacts of different shapes and sizes unleashed their most powerful power and formed a thick divine light shield to protect the fourth palace master. Kaboom! In the next moment, the Sword of Apocalypse slashed the fourth palace master with the power to destroy everything. The divine light shield that protected him was instantly shattered into pieces, and countless fragments of divine light burst out. The power of the Sword of Apocalypse was greatly reduced. It then hit the fourth palace master and sent him flying 30,000 miles away. He fell into the lake with blood spurting out of his 7 orifices. Chapter 4503. Without the protection of the celestial bell, the fourth hall master could not withstand the power of the Apocalypse sword even if he had a dozen Supreme King-level divine weapons to protect himself. Blood spurted out of his 7 orifices as he fell into the depths of the lake. He quickly circulated his energy to suppress his injuries and calm his surging divine power. However, he only used 3 breaths to suppress his injuries and teleport away from the bottom of the lake. He recalled the celestial bell and continued to kill Ji Tianxing. However, Ji Tianxing was already prepared and did not bother with him at all. The moment the Apocalypse sword sent the fourth hall master flying, Ji Tianxing did not pursue him. He decisively recalled Yun Yao Ji Ku and the others and teleported away as fast as he could. Swoosh! With a flash of light, he executed the so close, yet worlds apart ultimate technique and instantly teleported 100,000 miles away. In order to ensure that he could get rid of the fourth hall master completely this time, he did not hesitate to burn his qi and blood and risk the damage to his internal organs to perform imminent skyline again. Zhoosh. With another flash of divine light, Ji Tianxing teleported 100,000 miles again. However, after teleporting 100,000 miles, he appeared in the sky above a mountain range. He staggered and spat out blood. Performing imminent skyline twice in a row had exceeded the limit of his divine body and he suffered a backlash on the spot. Not only were his internal organs injured, but his meridians were also torn in more than a dozen places. He suffered serious internal injuries. For a moment, not only did he suffer great pain, but his divine power also became chaotic and his combat power weakened further. Fortunately, he was 200,000 miles away from the fourth hall master and he was relatively safe. However, he still could not let his guard down. He did not have time to treat his internal injuries and continued to teleport southwest. After that, he could no longer perform imminent skyline. He could only teleport 10,000 miles at a time and continue to travel. In just 5 breaths, Ji Tianxing was 300,000 miles away from the lake. At this time, the fourth hall master finally recovered from his internal injuries and controlled the celestial bell to search for Ji Tianxing. What a cunning guy. Instead of pursuing him, he took the opportunity to escape. The fourth palace master was surprised by Ji Tianxing's calmness and composure. In his opinion, if an ordinary person gathered a large number of subordinates and joined forces to injure a strong enemy, their morale would definitely be greatly boosted, and they would pursue the enemy confidently, vowing to heavily injure or kill the enemy. However, in reality, the fourth palace master's injuries did not affect him much. After suffering a loss, he would become more cautious and would not give Ji Tianxing any more chances. Even if Ji Tianxing had the help of many of his subordinates, if they dared to join forces to attack him, he would still be able to kill them one by one and finally get rid of Ji Tianxing. However, Ji Tianxing also seemed to understand this and decisively chose to retreat. This made the fourth palace master feel slightly regretful, but he also became more and more interested in Ji Tianxing. Extraordinary talent, outstanding aptitude, valiant strength, numerous means, meticulous thinking, and shrewd. Such a genius expert had almost no weaknesses, and was simply too difficult to deal with. However, the more difficult Ji Tianxing was to deal with, the more certain the fourth palace master was that he was the target that the Kongming temple was looking for. Soon, the fourth palace master collected his messy thoughts and released his divine sense to cover all directions, searching for Ji Tianxing's traces. His divine sense instantly covered a radius of 200,000 miles, and everything in this area was clearly reflected in his mind. Whether it was a leaf or a speck of dust, nothing could escape his perception. However, what surprised the fourth palace master was that he could not detect Ji Tianxing's traces. How could this be? In just a few breaths he could actually escape 200,000 miles away? The fourth palace master could also reach this speed if he used all his strength. However, he did not expect that Ji Tianxing, who had always been slow, and could not be compared to him, could also do it. Only then did he realize that Ji Tianxing had been concealing his strength all this time. This guy is so cunning. The fourth palace master frowned and could not help but murmur to himself. Then he used his ultimate skill to expand the coverage of his divine sense to a radius of 300,000 miles. This was already the limit of what his divine sense could explore. However, the result was still the same. Within a radius of 300,000 miles he could not find Ji Tianxing's traces. In fact, if the fourth palace master had expanded his divine sense to a radius of 300,000 miles from the beginning, he might have had a chance to capture Ji Tianxing's traces and aura. However, he had wasted 2 breaths of time, and Ji Tianxing had already flown more than 300,000 miles away. Because of this small difference, the fourth palace master had lost Ji Tianxing's traces and could no longer track him. Damn it! He actually escaped from under this emperor's nose? The fourth palace master stood in the sky in a daze. His face was very ugly and he only felt ashamed and angry. Originally, he had a well-thought-out plan and victory was in his hands. He did not expect to fail miserably. After all, he had underestimated Ji Tianxing and let him escape. If the other palace masters knew about this, he did not know how they would mock him. The fourth palace master was a little angry. He still did not give up and used his divine sense to search for Ji Tianxing's traces and aura. He could not determine the direction Ji Tianqing had escaped in. Did he continue south, turn southwest, or southeast? The only thing he could be sure of was that Ji Tianqing would definitely not escape to the north. Therefore, the fourth palace master's divine sense had to cover a very wide area and focus on searching in those three directions. Time passed quietly. Unknowingly, 100 breaths of time had passed. The fourth palace master searched the three directions twice, but couldn't find any useful clues. He immediately understood. Even when Ji Tianqing was fleeing in a panic, he did not forget to hide his tracks and aura, and did not leave any traces. To a God Emperor realm expert, this wasn't a difficult task. After all, a God Emperor level powerhouse had mastered thousands of laws and condensed Tao rhymes. They could merge and resonate with heaven and earth. As long as they wanted to hide, a God Emperor level powerhouse could not leave any traces in heaven and earth. Sigh. After confirming that he could not find Ji Tianqing, the fourth palace master felt a strong sense of defeat and could not help but sigh. Since he could not determine the direction Ji Tianqing had escaped, he could not chase after him. Being ridiculed by the other palace masters was a small matter. If Ji Tianqing really escaped, it would be the Kongming Temple's greatest loss. Thinking of this, the fourth palace master warned the sky in the south. After thinking for a moment, he continued to chase south. Although he was only 40% sure that Ji Tianqing would continue to fly south, he knew that Ji Tianqing would continue to fly south. But this was undoubtedly the best choice. At the very least, no matter whether Ji Tianqing escaped to the southwest or southeast, he would not be too far off. If he chased to the southwest and Ji Tianqing escaped to the southeast, then the distance between the two would increase. As he chased south, the fourth palace master hesitated for a moment. In the end, he took out a few communication jade slips and sent messages to the other palace masters. Even if he would be scolded by the first palace master and mocked by the other three palace masters, he had to report the truth. Chapter 4504. Ji Tianqing did not dare to stop. He endured his injuries and fled 1,000,000 miles away before he could relax a little. If it was before, the fourth palace master would have caught up with him before he could fly 1,000,000 miles away. After all, the fourth palace master was much faster than him. But this time he had fled 1,000,000 miles away, and the fourth palace master did not catch up with him. He released his divine sense to explore behind him, and he did not see any trace of the fourth palace master even after 200,000 miles. He was basically sure that he had shaken off the fourth palace master. Phew! Ji Tianqing let out a long sigh of relief and secretly thanked himself for his luck. This time Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others had contributed greatly to his successful escape from the fourth palace master's pursuit. Of course, it was also thanks to his concealment and the plan he had decided on early on. Only in this way could he explode with his strongest power at the critical moment and catch the fourth palace master off guard. He slowed down his flying speed and diverted a part of his energy to circulate and suppress the injuries in his internal organs. Although his injuries were not light, they were still within an acceptable range. At least the injuries in his divine body were not Tao injuries. He would be able to recover after a few months of recuperation. Ji Tianqing took 2 divine pills and silently circulated for a while to suppress his injuries. Then he changed his direction and flew toward the north. To put it simply, he was rushing back toward 7 Moons Mountain. The reason he did this was because he wanted to do the opposite. Previously, he was able to provoke the Qingyu Hall and the Hanya fleet and successfully ambush the Hanya God Emperor because he was good at reading people's minds. His plan succeeded. It was the same now. Although he had temporarily shaken off the fourth palace master, the fourth palace master would definitely not give up on hunting him down, let alone return to 7 Moons Mountain. The most likely possibility was that the fourth palace master would continue to chase him toward the south with unwillingness. In this way, if he continued to flee toward the southwest, he might be able to shake off the fourth palace master forever, but there was also a certain chance that the fourth palace master would catch up with him again. And the fourth palace master would never expect him to change his direction and flee toward 7 Moons Mountain. On the surface, it looked like he was walking right into a trap. Not to mention whether or not the master of Qingyu Hall would be able to find him. Just the other temple masters of the Kongming Temple would most likely head south to support the fourth temple master. If Ji Tianqing's luck was too bad, there was a certain chance that he would bump into those palace masters. However, the chances of that happening were minuscule. Ji Tianxing would not enter Mount Seven Moons, nor would he seek revenge on Qin Yu Hull. He would conceal his whereabouts and aura. When he was near Mount Seven Moons, he would turn east and try to leave Kongming Temple's territory as soon as possible. Even the temple masters of the Kongming Temple would not have guessed this escape route. This was because Ji Tianxing did not understand the structure of the planet of origin. Even he did not know how far east they had to fly before they could leave the Kongming Temple's territory. He did not even know what would happen along the way and when he would change directions. Since even he did not know this, the temple masters of the Kongming Temple would not be able to guess or deduce it. The fourth temple master rushed south. Along the way, he constantly used his divine abilities and ultimate skills to search for Ji Tianxing's whereabouts within a radius of 200,000 miles. However, he did not find anything. The further south he went, the more apprehensive he became and the less confident he became. Even though he knew that if he continued to chase aimlessly, the chances of finding Ji Tianxing would be very slim. However, before the first temple master gave a new order, he could not stop. He could only continue chasing. Unknowingly, 15 minutes had passed. A spiritual light flew from the sky and landed in front of the first temple master. Just as he expected, the first temple master sent back a message and gave him instructions. The first temple master was very disappointed that Ji Tianxing managed to shake off the fourth temple master. He ordered the fourth temple master to redeem himself. At the same time, the other three temple masters would speed up and come to support him as soon as possible. They would search for Ji Tianxing's whereabouts together. Anyway, the direction and area where Ji Tianxing escaped was in the southernmost part of the Kongming Temple's territory. If they continued south, it would be a desolate and dangerous area. That place was full of unknown dangers. Even a god emperor could not guarantee absolute safety. Therefore, Ji Tianxing's speed would definitely slow down. At that time, the four temple masters would lead thousands of elites and conduct a carpet search. They would eventually find Ji Tianxing. Thinking of this, the fourth temple master felt much more relaxed. Immediately after, another three spiritual lights flew from the sky and landed in front of the fourth temple master. There was no suspense. Of course, it was a message from the three temple masters. The three temple masters were all surprised and in disbelief that Ji Tianxing had successfully escaped. They were also a little suspicious of the fourth temple master. Although the three temple masters did not directly mock him, their words were full of mockery and ridicule, making the fourth temple master feel very embarrassed. The fourth temple master was full of shame and anger. He simply ignored the three temple masters and pretended that he had not received the message. Previously, Ji Tianxing had been chased by the fourth temple master for half a day. At this time he used a full 8 hours to return to the vicinity of Seven Moons Mountain. He moved alone and hid his whereabouts and aura at all times. He was very secretive. Unless it was the temple masters of the Kongming Temple within 100,000 miles of him, they would not be able to discover him. Otherwise, no one would be able to detect his presence. When he was a few 100,000 miles away from Seven Moons Mountain, Ji Tianxing changed his direction again and rushed toward the east. The rest of the journey was smooth, quiet, and safe. 2 days later, Ji Tianxing left the territory of the Qin Yu Hall and entered the sphere of influence of another temple master. He did not stop to rest, nor did he scout for information so as to not leave any traces. He continued on his journey towards the east without stopping to rest. Time passed silently. Unknowingly, another 8 days had passed. Ji Tianxing left the sphere of influence of the second temple master and entered the territory of the third temple master. At this time he was already safe enough. Therefore he asked the white dragon to steer the god-slaying battleship, conceal his tracks and continue east. He entered the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda, stayed in the distorted spacetime and began to heal his injuries. He focused on seclusion for 8 months and consumed many divine pills and cultivation resources. Finally, he healed the injuries of his divine body and restored his divine power to its peak state. At this time, only 5 days had passed in the outside world. After Ji Tianxing ended his seclusion, he first sent a voice transmission to the White Dragon. After knowing that there were no accidents on the way, he was truly relieved. Then he went to the 9th level of the Divine Pagoda and entered the Sea of Nirvana Flames to check on the Prajna God Emperor. Back then he had severely injured the Prajna God Emperor until he fainted, but he did not kill him. Instead he sealed him in the sea of nirvana flames. There was also Crimson Dawn deity king whose divine body was also destroyed. His severely injured divine spark was also sealed in the sea of nirvana flames. Ji Tianxing thought that only 10 days had passed. The Prajna God Emperor should still be unconscious. However, when he entered the sea of nirvana flames and saw the scene before him, he was stunned. The Prajna God Emperor, who should have been unconscious, was still lying peacefully in the middle of the sea of nirvana flames. However, she had already woken up. Her eyes were open and there was a confused look in her eyes. It was unknown what she was thinking. Chapter 4505. When Ji Tianxing entered the Nirvana Sea of Flames, he didn't cause any commotion. However, with the Prajna God Emperor's strength, she should have been able to sense it. However, she was still quietly lying in the Sea of Flames, her eyes open without any reaction. Since the Prajna God Emperor was in this state and didn't struggle to escape, Ji Tianxing had nothing to worry about. He calmly walked to the Prajna God Emperor's side, looking down at her without taking the initiative to speak. The two looked at each other, but the Prajna God Emperor only shot him a glance before looking away. Her gaze was unfocused. It didn't seem like she was looking at anything or searching for something. She had probably woken up a long time ago and understood her surroundings. She knew that this was a boundless sea of flames, and that there were all kinds of divine formations and magical arts sealing her. Most importantly, not only was she still alive, but Crimson Afterglow's divine spark was also alive. It was just that its injuries were a bit heavy and it was also sealed in the sea of flames. For the current Prajna God Emperor, only she and her disciple Crimson Afterglow were still alive, so she could be considered carefree. Ji Tianxing was silent, and the Prajna God Emperor simply closed her eyes, not intending to communicate. Logically speaking, the two were enemies and the Prajna God Emperor clearly didn't want to talk, so Ji Tianxing should have left. However, Ji Tianxing stood next to her, looking at her without saying a word. After a full 100 breaths of time, even with the Prajna God Emperor's mental state, she still felt weak under his gaze, inexplicably apprehensive, and a few strange thoughts appeared in her mind. In the end, it was the Prajna God Emperor who couldn't hold back, indifferently asking, Why don't you kill me?" Ji Tianxing raised his brows looking at her and asked, "I've only seen people beg to live, but I've never seen anyone beg to die. What, you don't want to live?" The Prajna God Emperor also frowned, clearly a bit angry at Ji Tianxing's feigned ignorance. "After your rebirth you've put in so much effort. Aren't you determined to take revenge? I am one of the 5 main culprits who killed you. How can you let me go?" Pausing for a moment, she added, "Do you think that killing me while I'm unconscious is too easy on me? So, you sealed me here and wanted to use some despicable and cruel methods to torture me so that you can vent your anger?" Ji Tianxing sighed slightly and said in a low voice, "Do you think that with my character I would do such a thing?" Prajna God Emperor snorted coldly and muttered, "Why can't I do it? You've done more cruel things than this." He. Ji Tianxing understood what she said, but he was speechless. He could only sneer. The Prajna God Emperor was silent for a moment. However, she couldn't help but ask, "For now, I can believe that you won't kill me. However, with your character, if you forgive me, you'll turn around and leave, no longer paying me any attention. You definitely won't seal me here. That's why I'm guessing that you definitely have some conditions or schemes." Ji Tianxing nodded and said, "You guessed correctly on this point. That's right. I can forgive you, let bygones be bygones, but you have to help me do something." "Are you trying to blackmail me? What if I don't agree?" The Prajna God Emperor finally opened her eyes, staring at Ji Tianxing with a judgmental gaze. Ji Tianxing chuckled and looked like he was about to turn around and leave. "I already said that I've already forgiven you. If you really aren't willing to help me do that, then you can just stay here and recover. When your injuries are more or less healed, you can leave at any time." After saying this, Ji Tianxing turned around to leave. He didn't have the slightest intention of threatening or forcing the Prajna God Emperor. The Prajna God Emperor felt that this was a bit unexpected. She couldn't help but frown and shout, "Stop." When he heard this shout that seemed cold but actually carried a trace of emotion, Ji Tianxing stopped as expected, a hint of a smile flashing past his eyes. There was nothing he could do about it. He understood the Prajna God Emperor's personality too well. The Prajna God Emperor's reaction was within his expectations a long time ago. After he turned around, the Prajna God Emperor remained silent for a moment. Only then did she ask in a low voice, "Speak, what do you want me to do?" Ji Tianqing said with a smile, "You and I both know that back then when the 5 of you joined hands to kill me, you were only following the general trend. The true culprits were Yu Ming, Azura, Dao Xingyun and Lu Zhiyang. Among the 4 of them, Yu Ming and Azura were the leaders while Dao Xingyun and Lu Zhiyang were the vassals. Thus, the ones I truly want to take revenge and wipe out a grudge, the ones I want to kill, are the 4 of them." When she heard up to here, the Prajna God Emperor had already guessed his thoughts. She subconsciously asked, "Could it be that you want to instigate me, have me help you take revenge and deal with the 4 of them?" Ji Tianqing nodded and explained, "You don't need to directly clash with them and kill them. You only need to provide me with information about them. At the crucial moment you also need to get close to them, hide by their side and act as my informant and spy." Before he even finished speaking, the Prajna God Emperor decisively refused. "Impossible. I will not agree to your request to harm my friends and brothers." The Prajna God Emperor had always been cold and aloof. Ji Tianqing didn't find it strange that she didn't agree to this matter. However, when he heard the word brothers, he couldn't help but sneer. "That's right. In the past, you and those 4 fellows did indeed call each other brother and sister. But you and I both know that it was just a very hypocritical and disgusting title. Did they really treat you as a sister? Are you really treating them as your brothers and respecting them sincerely? Between you and them, do you really trust each other completely without any suspicion or wariness?" The Prajna God Emperor was silent. She couldn't refute Ji Tianqing's words. Ji Tianqing continued, "Although you formed an alliance and worked together to break the defense of the Star of Origin, that was because you all had the same goal, which was to pursue immortality. Now you have achieved your goal and entered the Star of Origin. Your 5 forces are scattered all over the Star of Origin. Why didn't you gather at the first moment? Isn't it because you all have your own thoughts and don't trust each other enough? If not, why did you join the Kongming Temple and not join them?" The Prajna God Emperor's expression was a bit unnatural, and her eyes were a bit evasive. She weakly explained, "That's because we just entered the Star of Origin and weren't familiar with the layout and terrain. There was no way for us to gather together." Ji Tianqing's face was full of disdain as he rolled his eyes. He waved his hand and said, "This kind of flimsy reason is only enough to fool a child." The Prajna God Emperor was silent again. She was speechless. Ji Tianqing saw that she was hesitating. Her heart was in a dilemma. He knew that she was wavering, but she was still a bit conflicted. Therefore he left a sentence and left the Nirvana Sea of Flames. "You don't have to rush to answer me. You just need to think clearly the next time I come to find you." Chapter 4506. After leaving the Sea of Nirvana Flames, Ji Tianqing returned to the distorted spacetime and continued to cultivate. This time he had fought and chased after the 4th Palace Master for half a day. He had indeed tested his true strength. However, it also made him aware of his own problems and made him even more eager to increase his strength. Although in everyone's eyes he was already strong enough, talented enough and capable enough, he still had some requirements. In reality, not only did he have to take revenge on the 4 God Emperors, but he also had to deal with the experts of the various temples. With his current strength, it was already somewhat difficult to take revenge on the 4 God Emperors, not to mention clashing with the experts of the various temples. Therefore he cultivated in seclusion in the distorted spacetime, sparing no expense and expending vast amounts of cultivation resources to condense the second Taoist rhyme as soon as possible. In fact, he had been comprehending the heavenly Tao and fusing the power of heaven and earth in an attempt to condense the second Taoist rhyme. As for the second Taoist rhyme, he had already condensed the embryonic form and laid a solid foundation. The so-called Taoist rhyme sounded very mysterious, but it was actually quite simple. As long as a God Emperor expert fused a portion of his divine Tao law with his comprehension of heaven and earth, and then fused it with his own condensed heavenly Tao energy, he could condense the Taoist rhyme. Compared to the other God Emperor experts, Ji Tianqing had the advantage in the number of divine Tao laws he had grasped. Of course, his comprehension of the heavenly Tao was also deeper, and his compatibility with the heavenly Tao energy was more perfect than any other God Emperor. As a result, when he fought with the 4th Hall Master and the Prajna God Emperor, No matter how powerful the heavenly Tao energy and pressure these two god emperors released, it was very difficult to suppress Zhi Tianxing. Simply put, Zhi Tianxing had a unique advantage, and it was easier for him to condense the Taoist rhyme than other god emperors. During this closed-door cultivation, the first thing Zhi Tianxing dealt with was the spoils of war from the previous battle. Weapons, armors and so on did not enter his eyes. What he cared about the most were the godhead fragments left behind after those god king experts were killed. Zhi Tianxing's interspatial ring stored close to 100,000 godhead fragments. Those were the fragments of over 3,000 divine king experts after they died. They were all mixed together, and it was very difficult to piece them together again. More than half of them came from the god kings under the command of the Prajna god emperor. The other 40% came from the god kings of Qin Yu Hall. Zhi Tianxing did not reject any of them. He used the devouring divine ability and the heaven-mending orb to quickly and efficiently devour those divine deity fragments. On average, he would devour and refine 2 to 3 god kings' godhead fragments every day. Ever since he had broken through to the god emperor realm, it had become much easier for him to refine the godhead fragments of those god kings, and his speed had increased by several times. He had refined the godhead fragments of many god kings, and his goal was clear. He almost didn't try to plunder the divine soul memories in the fragments. He only searched for useful laws and divine patterns and absorbed vast amounts of divine power. Along with the passage of time, he would always be able to obtain a new divine Tao law every 2 or 3 days, and he would condense it into his godhead. Naturally, the more divine Tao laws he condensed, the more his strength would gradually increase. If the 4th Hall Master knew about this terrifying growth rate, the Kongming Temple would definitely pursue him even more crazily. Even if they had to pay a great price, the Kongming Temple would do everything in their power to capture him. Day after day, month after month, Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship eastward at a steady speed, constantly crossing over the territory of one branch after another. Along the way, the god-slaying battleship remained hidden. It did not stop, nor did it expose itself. Thus the journey was very peaceful. It did not attract anyone's attention, and of course, it did not encounter any twists and turns or trouble. Bai Long did not know just how vast the territory of the Kongming Temple was or how long it would take to fly out. However, he had heard from his master that the Kongming Temple had dozens of branches. The territory of each branch required 6 to 7 days of flight to cross over. The location of the Qin Yu Hall was south of the Kongming Temple. The god-slaying battleship flew eastward. It would have to pass through about 10 branches before it could leave the territory of the Kongming Temple. To put it simply, the god-slaying battleship would need to fly for at least 2 months, or even 2.5 months. Unknowingly, 2 months had passed. Bai Long thought that they should be about to leave the territory of the Kongming Temple. Thus, as he hurried along, he began to observe the surrounding terrain. He believed that there would definitely be some obvious features at the border of the Kongming Temple's territory. For example, there would be some landmark buildings or mountain ranges at the border of the territory, or soldiers patrolling or guarding the territory. However, it was a pity that Bai Long did not find any clues after observing for 3 days. He could only silently think that perhaps he had not reached the border of the Kongming Temple's territory. In that case, he would fly for another half a month. 2 months ago, the 4th Hall Master chased after Zhi Tianxing all the way to the south of the Kongming Temple. He was also very patient. After chasing for 5 days, he had no choice but to stop when he reached the southernmost part of the Qin Yu Hall's territory. Because that was not only the southernmost part of the Qin Yu Hall, but also the border of the temple's territory. If they continued to head south, they would enter the Endless Mountain Range. The Endless Mountain Range was shrouded in dense fog all year round. Ancient giant beasts of the godly king realm could often be seen moving about. There were also all kinds of dangers. It was said that before the Qin Yu Hall was established, a few peak godly kings had ventured into the depths of the Endless Mountain Range to explore and search for treasures. In the end, those peak godly kings encountered danger. They were attacked by many ancient giant beasts, and they even sensed the aura of an emperor-level powerhouse. In the end, those peak godly kings died in the depths of the Endless Mountain Range. They did not even see the true appearance of the emperor-level powerhouse. From then on, the news that there were emperor-level ferocious beasts in the Endless Mountain Range spread. Even though the Kongming Temple later established the Qin Yu Hall, They repeatedly warned the people of the Qingyu Hall not to go near the endless mountain range. The fourth hall master did not know Ji Tianxing's exact location, but he guessed that he had lost track of him. Of course, he would not enter the endless mountain range. Therefore, he sent a message back to the first hall master, asking for instructions on what to do next. The first hall master did indeed have heaven-defying methods and mysterious powers. He actually activated the temple's apocalypse altar, communicated with and sensed the heavenly Tao, and used a supreme technique to deduce Ji Tianxing's whereabouts. Although the result of his deduction was very vague, it only pointed to the east. But this answer was enough for the Kongming Temple. The first hall master decisively ordered the 4 hall masters to lead the elite experts to the east to pursue and search. This was because the apocalypse altar had given them an answer. They could confirm that the person they were looking for was heading east. After the 4 hall masters received the order, they were convinced and immediately rushed to the east as fast as they could. Chapter 4507. It took Ji Tianxing 2.5 months to reach the eastern border of the Kongming Temple on the deity-slaying battleship. However, the 4 temple masters of the Kongming Temple did not have to go through so much trouble and travel for 2 months. 10,000 years ago, the Kongming Temple had built a huge teleportation array in each of its branches. The 4 temple masters only needed to find the nearest branch and activate the teleportation array with their identity tokens to quickly reach the neighboring branch. They only needed to activate one teleportation array after another to cross dozens of branches in a day and reach the eastern region of the Kongming Temple. However, the spatial barrier of the planet of origin was abnormally strong. Only a god emperor could break it and use the teleportation divine ability. The teleportation arrays built by the various branches were all emperor-level divine arrays. Not only were these arrays of high grade, but they were also very difficult to build. It took thousands of years and a huge amount of cultivation resources. Every time the teleportation array was activated, it would also consume a huge amount of resources and treasures. Therefore, the teleportation arrays of each branch were the most precious treasures and treasures. They were often used as the last trump card of each branch to save their lives at a critical moment. Under normal circumstances, the teleportation arrays were closed. Only under special circumstances and with the orders of the 5 temple masters of the Kongming Temple, the various branches could activate the teleportation arrays. Only the 5 temple masters and the temple masters of the various branches were qualified to use the teleportation arrays. Moreover, the temple master had repeatedly ordered that the teleportation arrays could only be used when there was a major emergency or an extremely important mission. Therefore, the teleportation arrays set up by the Kongming Temple in each branch were only the Kongming Temple's secret weapons. They were not the usual mode of transportation. This was the reason why the second temple master did not use the teleportation arrays when he went to the Qingyu Hall to meet the Prajna God Emperor, and the second temple master and the Prajna God Emperor returned to the Kongming Temple together. 3 days later, the 4 temple masters led 4,000 elite experts and gathered in the eastern part of the Kongming Temple, in the city of Dongyintang. Dongyintang was located in the eastern part of the Kongming Temple. It was the closest branch to the border. It had been established even earlier than Qingyu Hall, and its influence and population had surpassed Qingyu Hall. When the 4 hall masters arrived at the Dongyin Hall, the Dongyin Hall master was startled by their favor and quickly received them respectfully. The Dongyin Hall master was very nervous. He couldn't figure out the purpose of the 4 hall masters' visit, so he asked indirectly. After all, ever since the establishment of the East Glabella Hall, there had never been a case of 4 hall masters arriving at the same time. The 4 temple lords did not explain the specific reason, nor did they mention the matter of the Prajna God Emperor joining the Kongming Temple. They only said that they were carrying out a mission to capture an expert. Only Qingyu Hall and the 2 neighboring branches knew that the Kongming Temple wanted to recruit the Prajna God Emperor. The Dongyin Hall was located at the border of the Kongming Temple, so it was not well informed and did not know about this matter. However, when the Dongyin Hall master heard that the 4 hall masters were moving out at the same time and were personally leading a team to capture someone, he was instantly shocked. He could not imagine what kind of strength and methods this expert had to provoke the 4 hall masters to personally take action. There was no doubt that this was a God Emperor level expert. The Dongyin Hall master knew very well that the Kongming Temple wanted to capture a God Emperor level expert. This was not something he could participate in. He was only a peak divine king. If he dared to participate in a battle between God Emperor level experts, there was basically no way he could survive. However, the more he feared something, the more it would happen. The second Hall Master straightforwardly stated that they needed the full cooperation of the Dongyin Hall Master for this capture mission. The Dongyin Hall Master complained incessantly in his heart, but he did not dare to show any signs of resistance. He could only respectfully express his obedience. After that, the second Hall Master ordered him to mobilize 2,000 Divine King-level experts to be on standby at any time. The Dongyin Hall Master could not refuse and could only do as he was told. After the Dongyin Hall Master left the meeting hall to mobilize the troops, the 4 Hall Masters began to discuss the plan. The first Hall Master had received a revelation from the Apocalypse altar that Ji Tianxing was definitely in the east of the Kongming Temple. The Hall Masters could guess that Ji Tianxing was definitely fleeing east to escape the Kongming Temple's territory as soon as possible. With Ji Tianxing's speed, it would take him at least 2 months to reach the vicinity of the Dongyin Hall. The 4 of them arrived at the Dongyin Hall in 3 days. At this time, Ji Tianxing was still on the way and would take another 2 months to arrive. The 4 Hall Masters had 2 months to prepare. Naturally, they could not just sit around and wait. They had to make ample preparations and seize the initiative as much as possible. Therefore, after a discussion, the 4 Hall Masters decided to split up and expand the search area. The second Hall Master oversaw the Dongyin Hall and was in charge of commanding the Dongyin Hall's military forces to search the Dongyin Hall's territory. The other 3 Hall Masters rushed to the 3 nearby halls and mobilized the military forces of the various halls to set up traps and ambushes in advance. Of course, the traps and ambushes were secondary. The most important thing was to use all kinds of abilities, including but not limited to setting up divine formations to detect Ji Tianxing's tracks and aura. After the 4 Hall Masters reached a consensus, they quickly took action. The second Hall Master stayed behind to guard the Dongyin Hall while the other 3 Hall Masters rushed to the other halls. As the 4 Hall Masters took action, a large invisible net also extended from the eastern border, waiting for Ji Tianxing to walk right into the trap. After more than 2 months of continuous flying, it was very dull and dry. However, after the god-slaying battleship reached the eastern border of the Kongming Temple, White Dragon did not let down his guard. Instead, he became even more cautious. This was because he knew that the closer he was to leaving the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence, the more he could not let down his guard. Since the Kongming Temple wanted to capture his master at all costs and no matter what methods they used, the Kongming Temple would not give up so easily. Even if they temporarily lost track of his master, the Kongming Temple would think of a way to surround and intercept his master. White Dragon felt that it was unlikely that the Kongming Temple would guess that his master would escape from the east. However, he did not know much about the Kongming Temple and could not guess what other tricks the Kongming Temple had up their sleeves. What if the Kongming Temple had some rare treasure or some unknown ability that could really deduce his master's whereabouts? This possibility could not be ruled out. Therefore, White Dragon slowed down the speed of the god-slaying battleship. As he flew east, he carefully surveyed his surroundings. Whenever he discovered any abnormalities in the area or any obscure ripples of divine power, he would categorize them as traps and ambushes. He would rather take a detour than approach them rashly. Facts had proven that caution was the parent of safety. White Dragon's caution was indeed useful. 2 months and 9 days later in the evening, the god-slaying battleship flew past a vast primitive forest. White Dragon used a mystic technique to detect that tens of thousands of miles to his left, there was a group of Godly King experts flying past. The auras of these Godly King experts were special and unfamiliar. They were most likely Desolate Race experts. From the attitude of the Desolate Race Godly King team, they were likely patrolling or searching for something. Chapter 4508. To Ji Tianxing and company, other than themselves, anyone else on the origin planet could be an enemy. Suddenly seeing a group of patrolling Desolate Race Godly Kings, Bai Long's first reaction was, they were definitely experts sent by the Kongming Temple. Their mission and goal was most likely to kill his master. Hence Bai Long chose to stop moving forward. He stayed in the sky, concealing his tracks and aura. When the patrolling Desolate Race Godly Kings left, He controlled the god-slaying battleship to continue moving forward. Although he had managed to avoid the patrolling team without being discovered by the desolate race godly kings. But when he controlled the god-slaying battleship to continue moving forward, he gradually felt that something was amiss. The surrounding mountains and rivers looked normal on the surface. But after careful investigation he realized that there were some abnormalities at every set distance. For example, some of the seemingly normal forests and mountain peaks had hidden god power fluctuations. If he were to rashly pass by, even if he did not touch the forests and mountain peaks, he could still be detected. Of course, the arrays hidden in the forests and mountain peaks were just small warning mechanisms. They were used for surveillance and early warning. What made him feel even more uneasy was that he had discovered 4 traps along the way. They were real traps. They were made up of several layers of arrays and had powerful killing power. Although those traps were made up of king-level god arrays and could not threaten the god-slaying battleship, much less hurt Bai Long and company. But Bai Long knew that once those traps were triggered, they would be effective even if they could not hurt him and the god-slaying battleship. At the very least they could detect the god-slaying battleship's tracks and location, exposing everyone to danger. At the same time, the god-slaying battleship had traveled for 2 months and 10 days. Ji Tianxing had been in seclusion in the distorted spacetime and had cultivated for 9.5 years. In these 9 years he had refined the spoils of war from before. There were a total of more than 3,000 godly king-level godhead fragments. What was worth celebrating was that Ji Tianxing had absorbed more than 300 types of divine Tao laws, as well as endless god power. Currently, the number of laws he had grasped had reached a shocking number of 2,200. And his strength had increased by about 50%. Of course, the God Emperor realm was determined by the amount of Tao aura. Even though Ji Tianxing's strength had increased by 50% and his battle prowess had been strengthened a lot, it was not obvious. His final objective was still to utilize formidable divine energy to condense numerous divine Tao laws, fuse his comprehension of the heavens and the earth, and condense the energy of the heaven Tao he possessed into the aura of the Tao. It took him 5 years to complete the process. He had successfully formed the second Tao rhyme on top of the original one. Ji Tianxing, who possessed 2 Taoist rhymes, was still in the God Emperor initial stage. However, his strength had increased by leaps and bounds. If he were to face the 4th Palace Master again, he would not be in such a sorry state like before, where he would be completely suppressed by the 4th Palace Master. Even if he might not be able to defeat the 4th Palace Master, he would definitely not be at a disadvantage. After successfully condensing the second Taoist rhyme, Ji Tianxing cultivated in seclusion for another 2 months to stabilize his cultivation base and absorb more divine power. He calculated that according to the speed of the deity-slaying battleship, they should reach the eastern border of the Kongming Temple soon. Therefore he decisively ended his seclusion and left the distorted spacetime. After leaving the distorted spacetime, the first thing he did was to head to the 9th level of the Divine Pagoda to visit the Wisdom God Emperor. Zhou. With a flash of divine light, Ji Tianxing entered the 9th level of the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda and appeared in the vast Nirvana Sea of Flames. The surging Nirvana Sea of Flames was as blazing and dazzling as ever. Godly King Crimson Afterglow's godhead was still sealed by the 5-colored divine light as it floated above the Sea of Flames. There were still a few cracks on the surface of the godhead that could not be repaired for the time being. Godly King Crimson Afterglow was also unconscious. If Ji Tianxing did not remove the seal, her godhead would not be able to repair its injuries and would continue to be in a deep sleep. Not far away, the Wisdom God Emperor was no longer lying down like before. Instead, she was sitting cross-legged in the 5-colored light barrier. She did not touch or break the array formation and 5-colored light barrier that sealed her. This was because she knew that Ji Tianxing no longer had any hatred for her. As long as Ji Tianxing was willing, he could remove the seal on her at any time. Ever since Ji Tianxing had spoken to her, she weighed the pros and cons and hesitated for 2 days before coming to a decision. Afterward, she began to cultivate in the 5-colored light barrier, slowly healing her injuries. 2 months sounded like a long time, but for a God Emperor expert, it was not even enough for basic external injuries. Her injuries did not improve for the time being, and she still looked a little haggard and weak. When Ji Tianxing appeared in the Nirvana Sea of Flames, she immediately sensed it. This time she did not pretend to be indifferent and unaware like before. When Ji Tian walked to the side of the five-colored light barrier, she stopped circulating her energy to heal her injuries and opened her eyes to look at Ji Tianxing. I originally thought that you would let me think for 2 or 3 days before coming to ask for an answer. I didn't expect that you would actually wait for more than 2 months. How patient. Hanya God Emperor looked at Ji Tianxing with an indifferent expression, her tone calm but carrying a trace of ridicule. Clearly, she felt that Ji Tianxing was deliberately stalling for time to embarrass her. Ji Tianxing was too lazy to explain anything, going straight to the point. It seems like you've already thought it through. Can you give me an answer now? Hanya God Emperor raised her eyebrows, a bitter smile on her lips. Heh, you already know the answer, so why ask me? Moreover, do you think I have any other choice? Ji Tianxing understood her meaning, but he pretended not to understand, wanting to hear her say it herself. Thus he asked even though he already knew the answer. Since you're saying this, then I'll take it as you agreeing to my conditions? Hanya God Emperor laughed bitterly again, coldly saying, You personally destroyed my fleet and 100,000 soldiers, which I spent 1,000 years to nurture. Now only Crimson Afterglow and I are left to rely on each other. Where do you think I can go? To the Kongming Temple or any other temple? I'm already useless. As for Azura Yuming and the other two, when I had 100,000 soldiers I was still on equal footing with them, discussing plans with them. Now even if I were to join them, how much attention would I receive? Rather than become their vassal, I might as well agree to your conditions. After all, you're more reliable than the 4 of them. Seeing that Hanya God Emperor was no longer pretending to be strong and arrogant, finally admitting and facing reality, Ji Tianxing revealed a smile. Very good, since you can understand, then there's no need for me to waste my breath. Ji Tianxing nodded in satisfaction, waving his hand to remove the sealing formation on Hanya God Emperor. I'll undo your seal first so as to not affect your recovery here. Once your injuries are more than half healed, I'll let you leave and approach those 4 God Emperor. Not long after, Ji Tianxing removed the sealing formation, saying, Since you and I are already working together, you should tell me their whereabouts and current situation, right? Chapter 4509. Ji Tianxing wanted to find the 4 God Emperors for revenge, and the most important prerequisite was to know the location and current situation of the 4 God Emperors. Otherwise, with the vastness of the Star of Origin, how long would it take him to find the 4 God Emperors? He wanted to find out the location of the 4 God Emperors, and asking the Prajna God Emperor was the best shortcut. Because he believed that the Prajna God Emperor and the other 4 God Emperors were still at the stage of seeming to be united but actually divided. Even if they were wary of each other and had their own thoughts, they were still allies on the surface and would exchange information. Sure enough, the Prajna God Emperor only hesitated for a moment before nodding and agreeing to Ji Tianxing. I can tell you the location and current situation of the 4 of them. But before that, I still want to ask you, how did you enter the Star of Origin and secretly follow me? Since the hatred between the 2 of them had been eliminated, now that they wanted to work together, of course they had to be honest. The Prajna God Emperor was willing to share information with Ji Tianxing, but Ji Tianxing also had to answer the doubts in her heart. Ji Tianxing understood this logic, so he naturally wouldn't refuse. He said, Back then, after I pacified the 5 continents of the God realm, I handed over all the subsequent matters to my trusted subordinates and let them handle them. I rushed to the depths of the void as fast as I could and found the Star of Origin. At that time, you just broke through the defensive layer of the Star of Origin and entered with great fanfare. Do you still remember the gap you broke through? After you entered the Star of Origin, the gap was quickly closing. But no matter how fast it was, it still took nearly an hour to completely close. I was behind you less than an hour apart, and before the gap closed I entered the Star of Origin. After that, I found your fleet and have been following behind it, waiting for an opportunity to sneak into a god ship and take over Feiyang Shenwang. After listening to Ji Tianxing's narration, the Prajna God Emperor finally understood the whole story and could not help but reveal a trace of a bitter smile. It's really a mistake. I didn't think that I would have overlooked this detail, which gave you the opportunity to take advantage of me. Ji Tianxing also smiled and comforted him. You and the tens of thousands of soldiers have spent thousands of years and endless resources to break the defense of the planet of origin. At that time you were overjoyed and your emotions were too agitated. It's normal for you to overlook some things. If you can hold back your excitement, guard the gap and enter the star of origin when it is completely closed, maybe I won't have a chance. The Prajna God Emperor also felt relieved. This matter sounded very coincidental, but it was actually inevitable. She and the other 4 God Emperors had spent thousands of years of effort to break through the defense of the planet of origin. How could they not be excited? Not to mention her, even those 4 crafty old God Emperor would have been in a state of excitement at that time, and would definitely have overlooked something. If you want to blame someone, you can only blame Ji Tianxing's arrival on the planet of origin. It was too coincidental. However, Ji Tianxing had just occupied the heavenly world and did not even deal with the follow-up matters. He rushed to the planet of origin as quickly as possible, so this result was also reasonable. Well, man proposes but God disposes. You have taken advantage of the heaven's fate. I did not lose unjustly. The Prajna God Emperor sighed and did not delve further into this matter. Since you arrived when we entered the planet of origin, then you should have seen that the 5 of us are scattered all over the planet of origin. After breaking through the defense of the planet of origin, we led our soldiers and entered the planet of origin from different directions. Their encounters were similar to mine. Not long after entering the planet of origin, Shura and Dao Xingyun met the natives of the planet of origin, which were the desolate race. The desolate race that the Shura God Emperor came into contact with belonged to the Xianxia temple. He fell into the Xianxia temple's sphere of influence. However, the Shura God Emperor was much more cautious than I was. After he came into contact with the desolate race, he hid very well and did not expose the whereabouts of his fleet. He had been secretly observing the desolate race, and later hid his fleet and soldiers in an uninhabited area. He came into contact with the desolate race alone. Speaking of this, his method was very similar to yours. He hid in the dark and attacked a god king of the desolate race. He possessed the god king of the desolate race and successfully infiltrated the branch. 2.5 months ago, that was the last time I contacted him. At that time, he was already familiar with the branch and had a rough understanding of the Xianxia temple's situation. As for what he would do next, I do not know. But from what I know of him, it is unlikely that he would join the Xianxia temple. The Prajna God Emperor analyzed seriously and gave her judgment. However, Ji Tianxing's lips curled into a playful smile as he asked, "What if the Xianxia temple is like the Kongming temple, and is also pursuing the mystery of eternal life with all their might? What if the Xianxia temple is like the Kongming temple and has already obtained some clues? Do you think the Shura God Emperor would not be tempted?" Hearing these 3 sentences, the Prajna God Emperor's body suddenly trembled and her face turned cold. She slowly turned her head and stared sharply at Ji Tianxing. She asked in a deep voice, "You know all about it?" Her meaning was obvious. The reason why she was willing to join the Kongming temple was because the Kongming temple had grasped the mystery of eternal life. She thought that this matter was very confidential, but she did not expect Ji Tianxing to know about it. Ji Tianxing smiled and explained, "Don't forget, after I possessed Feiyang Shenwang, I followed Qixia and you to the 7 Moons Mountain to meet the second palace master. Other than the news I heard, it is not difficult for me to guess the reason." The Prajna God Emperor snorted unhappily and muttered softly, "I did not expect that the former you would have such a drastic change, becoming so sinister and cunning. What did you say?" Ji Tianxing frowned and stared at her sternly. The Prajna God Emperor pretended not to hear and changed the topic without changing her expression. Not long after Dao Xingyun entered the planet of origin, he encountered a group of desolate race god kings. They were the people under the Taiyu shrine. His situation was the same as mine. His entire fleet was exposed. However, there was no conflict between the 2 sides. The people of the Taiyu shrine were very polite to them and welcomed them into the base. Dao Xingyun led the fleet and stayed in the temple for more than a month. Later, the temple master of the Taiyu shrine personally went to meet him as if to rope him in. I do not know what they talked about or what they talked about. In short, Dao Xingyun was vague when he contacted me, as if he was hiding something. However, what you said just now reminded me. There are 4 temples on the planet of origin, each with tens of thousands of years of history. Logically speaking, their strength should be about the same. Since the Kongming temple has grasped the mystery of eternal life, the other 3 temples should not be too bad. Therefore, Dao Xingyun was willing to join the Taiyu shrine, most likely because of the mystery of eternal life, just like me. Chapter 45:10. In Ji Tianxing's heart, among the 5 god emperors, Pan Ruo God Emperor was the weakest. Not only did she have obvious flaws and weaknesses, but she was also not ruthless enough. Her shrewdness and scheming were also slightly inferior to the others. Other than her, Dao Xingyun was the weakest in terms of strength and means. Therefore, Dao Xingyun knew that there was enmity between the 5 god emperors, and each had their own thoughts, so they would definitely find their own way out. Of course, joining the Taiyu Shrine was the best choice. Not only could they quickly gain a foothold on the planet of origin, but they could also come into contact with the mystery of eternal life earlier. On this point, it happened to coincide with Pan Ruo God Emperor's thoughts. Then, Pan Ruo God Emperor began to talk about the situation of the Zhuyang God Emperor and the god of the underworld. After the Zhuyang God Emperor and the god of the underworld entered the planet of origin, they landed in a desolate area. They searched 100 million miles, but did not meet any desolate race beings. Not only did the desolate area have inexhaustible cultivation resources and treasures, but it also had endless dangers. In the past few months, their divine warships and soldiers had been damaged. At most, they lost thousands of people and at least hundreds of soldiers. In the first month, they did not know what was going on and did not know anything about the planet of origin. Later, after we exchanged messages and introduced the situation of the planet of origin to them, they made up their minds to settle down in the desolate area. Hearing this, Ji Tianxing nodded slightly in agreement. The god of the underworld is the most shrewd, the most powerful, and the most arrogant one. With his character, even if he knew of the existence of the temple, he would not join any of them. He is not willing to submit to others and would rather occupy a mountain and be a king, finding his own way out. However, this is under the condition that he does not know about the mystery of eternal life. If any of the temples used the mystery of eternal life as a condition to negotiate with him, he might be swayed. Pan Ruo God Emperor nodded and continued. In the past few months, the god of the underworld had indeed set up camp in the desolate area. He found a spiritual vein and treasure land and built a city. However, 2 months ago when I contacted him, he said that he had come into contact with the desolate race beings. A few 100 million miles to the east of him, there is a branch, the Pantheon of Immortality. Currently, the god of the underworld has interacted with the people of the Pantheon of Immortality. Although there was no conflict or battle, they were both on their guard against each other. So, the god of the underworld and god of the underworld is the god of the underworld, as languages. So they are temporarily unable to communicate. Ji Tianxing pondered for a moment and analyzed. To the god of the underworld, learning the desolate race's language is a very simple matter. Even if they are temporarily unable to communicate, that is because both sides are wary and on guard. In my estimation, the god of the underworld will only need a little more time. He will eventually come into contact with the people of the Pantheon of Immortality. When the people of the Pantheon of Immortality want to recruit him, they just need to present the mystery of eternal life to attract the god of the underworld. He is very ambitious, so he will definitely not give up on this opportunity. Pan Ruo God Emperor nodded slightly, indicating his agreement with his deduction and analysis. You already know the situation of the 4 of them. In terms of location and distance, we are actually very far away from them. Even if you travel without rest, it will probably take you more than 10 years to find them. The crux of the matter is that other than Lu Zhiyong, the other 3 have come into contact with the temples. Once you seek revenge on them, if they are no match for you, they will very likely side with the other temples and use the power of the 3 temples to deal with you. Ji Tianxing nodded and asked again. Previously you went to the Kongming Temple's headquarters. What did you see and learn? Pan Ruo God Emperor pondered for a moment and shook her head. I only stayed in the Kongming mystic realm for a few days and stayed in a divine palace. I did not have the time to walk around or investigate. The original plan was for the Kongming Temple to hold a grand ceremony to officially confer me the title of 6th Temple Lord. Only after I officially joined the Kongming Temple would I be able to come into contact with some secrets. Unfortunately, the day before the ceremony, Qin Yu Hall fought with my soldiers. Upon saying this, she glared at Ji Tianxing with lingering anger. Although she was very angry for some reason, that exquisite face without killing intent and clear eyes actually had a different charm. Ji Tianxing was startled for a moment, but his expression did not change as he shifted his gaze and asked again. Not to mention secrets, could it be that you did not even see a map or a few ancient books? I did. Pan Ruo God Emperor nodded, saying, there is a study in that divine palace. There is indeed a map of the Star of Origin and a detailed map of the Kongming Temple. There are also several hundred books of all kinds. I roughly flipped through them but did not take a book with me. I only memorized the contents of a few books. Ji Tianqing was a bit relieved, saying, "How about this? You record the contents of those 2 maps and books in a jade slip for me." Pan Ruo God Emperor glanced at him and asked coldly, "Are you ordering me?" Ji Tianqing shrugged, saying with a look of indifference, "If you want to understand it this way, I can't do anything about it." Pan Ruo God Emperor furrowed his brows in anger, gritting his silver teeth, asking in a heavy voice, "Then what if I am not willing to listen to your orders?" A defeated opponent has nothing to say. Ji Tianqing raised his brows, revealing a hint of a playful smile. Then he pointed at the sea of flames not far away, at Crimson Dawn Deity King's godhead sealed by a great formation. Her godhead has been heavily damaged. If she is not treated in time, she will remain unconscious. If this drags on for too long, it might affect her divine foundation, and she will be destined to never have the chance to break through to the God Emperor realm. Pan Ruo God Emperor was even more furious, glaring fiercely at Ji Tianqing, gnashing his teeth and shouting coldly, "I really don't dare believe it. How did you become so shameless, so treacherous and cunning?" "Many thanks for the praise. I will continue to work hard." Ji Tianqing smiled disapprovingly. "You can leave. I don't want to see you." Pan Ruo God Emperor turned his head away, not wanting to pay attention to him, nor did he want to see him. "I will come find you in a few days. I hope your map and book have already been completed." Ji Tianqing chuckled as he turned to leave, not forgetting to add, "Remember to draw carefully, don't make any mistakes and don't leave out anything." Pan Ruo God Emperor finally lost his composure, gnashing his teeth and shouting in a low voice, so angry that he almost shut himself up. "Ha ha ha." Ji Tianqing felt an inexplicable sense of comfort when he saw how angry she was, but she couldn't beat him and could only endure the humiliation. He raised his head and laughed loudly as he left the sea of flames. He had just entered the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship and was about to ask Bai Long where they were. However, Bai Long's expression was grave and he reported in a low voice, "Master, we have been ambushed." Chapter 45:11. In fact, 2 hours ago White Dragon had already sensed that something was amiss. Back then, not only did he see the patrolling desolate race godly monarchs, he also sensed that there were traps and ambushes everywhere in the mountains and rivers. However, he raised his guard, believing that by being careful he would be able to avoid the traps and ambushes. Furthermore, he knew that his master was in reclusive cultivation, trying his best to condense the second Tao charm. To his master, this was an extremely important matter to raise his strength. There was no room for failure. Hence, before the matter really happened, he did not want to disturb his master, so as to not delay his master's cultivation. Now, before he could report the situation, his master had appeared behind him. This undoubtedly meant that his master had ended his reclusive cultivation. White Dragon did not even have the time to ask his master if he had successfully condensed the second Tao charm. He immediately reported the situation. Upon hearing the news, Ji Tianqing subconsciously frowned. He released his perception in all directions to investigate the situation. He saw that the god-slaying battleship was flying over a vast mountain range. The surrounding area was hundreds of thousands of miles of mountains and primordial forests. Ji Tianqing scanned the area with his perception and he acutely sensed that there were divine arrays hidden in 2 mountain peaks behind him to the left and in front of him to the right. There was an obscure divine power fluctuation. Although the 2 divine arrays were not large in scale and did not have much destructive power, making it difficult for them to pose a threat to the god-slaying battleship. However, Ji Tianqing could guess that the 2 divine arrays were not used to ambush or attack the god-slaying battleship. They were most likely used to monitor the surroundings and scout for any movements. In other words, the god-slaying battleship's location had been exposed. Other than the 2 divine arrays, Ji Tianqing discovered that on both sides of the battleship, there were 2 desolate race godly monarchs teams flying at full speed in the sky about 70 to 80,000 miles away. The 2 teams were formed by 30 desolate race godly monarchs. They were fully armed and were approaching the god-slaying battleship from the sides. They did not directly attack the god-slaying battleship. Instead, they approached the god-slaying battleship from the sides, as if they were tailing and intercepting it. There was no need to guess. This was definitely the periphery of the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence. The two desolate race godly monarch teams were definitely citizens of the Kongming Temple. From this point, Ji Tianxing could also determine that the Kongming Temple had indeed not given up on capturing him. They were still mobilizing all their forces to search for his whereabouts. However, there was one thing he couldn't understand. How could the temple masters of the Kongming Temple determine that he fled from the east? He recalled carefully that when he escaped he didn't leave any traces behind. Could it be that the Kongming Temple had mobilized millions of people to conduct a carpet search in all 8 directions? If that was the case, no matter which direction he fled in, he would definitely be intercepted. Of course, the Kongming Temple's decision showed their determination. Ji Tianxing didn't give the order. He was frowning and thinking about a series of follow-up matters. The White Dragon did not receive any orders. It steered the god-slaying battleship forward. He knew very well that his master could use his divine powers to wipe out the two desolate race godly monarch teams in a very short period of time. However, doing so would still waste some time. The two desolate race godly monarch teams were likely scouts and outposts. They were following the god-slaying battleship closely without launching an attack. They were definitely waiting for reinforcements to arrive. If the god-slaying battleship stopped for a moment, it was very likely that it would fall into an encirclement and be in danger. Ji Tianxing also thought of this problem, so he did not plan on dealing with the two desolate race godly monarch teams. What he was considering was that the god-slaying battleship had been traveling for 2.5 months. How far were they from the border of the Temple of Kongming at this moment? Which temple master of the Temple of Kongming was it that ambushed and tried to kill him? Or, which temple masters were it? At this moment, the White Dragon noticed that his master was in deep thought. He could not help but remind him, "Master, we will definitely be able to leave the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence in another day. In the previous 2 million miles, I discovered many small arrays and a small number of traps. Other than these two teams following us, I also encountered a few patrolling teams and brushed past them. I suspect that they had discovered us at that time. Now there must be a large number of experts rushing over to provide reinforcements. Master, what do you think?" After hearing the White Dragon's explanation, Ji Tianxing had a deeper understanding of his current situation. He knew that the situation was urgent and that he could not afford to take any risks, so he made a decisive decision. "White Dragon, stay in the battleship and wait for orders. I will put away the battleship and travel at full speed. I should be able to shake off these desolate race godly monarchs." After saying that, Ji Tianxing's figure flashed and left the god-slaying battleship, appearing in the sky. Of course, he had converged his aura and concealed his whereabouts. Those desolate race godly monarchs could not detect him. Swish. With a thought, he controlled the god-slaying battleship to shrink to the size of a sesame seed and put it back into his body. As such, the two desolate race godly monarch teams in the sky completely lost their target. Originally, the god-slaying battleship was in an invisible state. Through the nearby divine arrays, they could sense the god-slaying battleship's aura and location. Now it was blank and they could not sense anything. The desolate race godly monarchs in the two teams were stunned for a moment before they realized that the situation had changed. They immediately sent out transmission jade slips to report the latest situation to their leaders. And at this moment, Ji Tianxing, who was in an invisible state, used so close, yet worlds apart. He instantly traversed 150,000 miles, easily shaking off the two desolate race godly monarch teams. Previously, when he used this divine power, he could only traverse 100,000 miles. However, after condensing 2 Dao charms, his strength had greatly increased, allowing him to traverse 150,000 miles in an instant. Furthermore, when he used this divine power, he expended much less god power. The burden on his body was also reduced greatly. Disregarding the outcome of fighting the 4th Palace Master after his strength increased. Just his so close, yet worlds apart was enough to help him shake off the 4th Palace Master's pursuit. From the looks of it, Ji Tianxing seemed to have jumped out of the encirclement and was about to leave without anyone noticing. However, good things did not last long. He continued flying another 100,000 miles before he saw another desolate race godly monarch team in the sky nearby. They were rushing forward at a fast speed, looking murderous. Ji Tianxing was certain that the 30-man desolate race godly monarch team would definitely not be able to discover him. Hence, the reason why the desolate race godly monarch team was in such a hurry was definitely because they had received some orders, and it was related to the plan to kill him. Ji Tianxing frowned as a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. He had a premonition that there was definitely a massive ambush ahead. Furthermore, there was a God Emperor realm expert presiding over it. The facts proved that Ji Tianxing had guessed correctly. Chapter 45:12. When Ji Tianxing continued advancing another 100,000 miles, his perception had indeed detected that there were more than 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs gathered in the sky above the mountains in front of him. The 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs were a mile apart from each other, forming a 1,000-mile-long defensive line in the sky. At the same time, there were even more desolate race godly monarchs gathering from various places. Although there were many desolate race godly monarchs and they looked murderous and terrifying, Ji Tianxing did not think much of them. What really caught his attention and made him wary was the battleship behind the 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs. It was a 1,000-feet-long black battleship with a cold and domineering exterior. Its surface was engraved with the Kongming Temple's emblem, as well as an ancient and unknown divine beast. The battleship remained motionless in the sky, exuding an invisible might and pressure. Ji Tianxing could sense that there was an extremely obscure and low-key aura within the battleship. It was silently fluctuating. In an instant he could determine that it was a God Emperor expert, the Kongming Temple's Temple Lord. Ji Tianxing was no stranger to this aura. He had once seen it in the Seven Moons Mountains meeting hall. That's right, the God Emperor expert in the battleship was the second Temple Lord. Ji Tianxing immediately frowned and stopped flying. He silently converged his aura and observed the battleship's movements. The 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs did not sense his existence and were still vigilantly observing their surroundings. However, Ji Tianxing sensed that the second Temple Lord's aura fluctuated momentarily before calming down. Oh no. He has already sensed my arrival and might be searching for my location. A cold beam flashed in Ji Tianxing's eyes as his expression turned even more vigilant. He tried his best to converge his aura to ensure that he would not expose his location. Then he quietly moved to the side. This was because he could only be sure that the second Temple Lord and the 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs were lying in ambush once again. However, he could not be sure if there were other Temple Lords or even more desolate race godly monarchs rushing over. To be safe, he naturally had to find a way to leave this place and avoid the second Palace Master's ambush. Then he could smoothly escape from the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence. However, Ji Tianxing did not have enough understanding of the second Palace Master and underestimated him. Just as he quietly moved to the left, the second Palace Master, who was in charge of the warship, suddenly flew out of the warship. Swish! With a flash of divine light, the second Hall Master suddenly appeared above the warship. His eyes were like torches as he stared at Ji Tianxing's location. An aura that could shake the heavens and the earth erupted from his body. Today he had changed from his usual silver-white robe to a dignified and austere black robe. His unkempt white hair and beard were neatly combed, looking as sharp as a sword. When Ji Tianxing first met him, he was slovenly and looked quite amiable. But today the second Palace Master was like an angry lion. His body was exuding fighting spirit and killing intent. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the invisible Ji Tianxing. He used his consciousness to lock onto Ji Tianxing's location as he revealed a cold smile. Hehehe. Young man, it was not in vain for me to wait here for so long. You are finally here. The second Palace Master's voice was deep as he sneered with a hoarse voice. Ji Tianxing felt somewhat helpless. Since the other party had seen through his disguise, it was useless for him to continue hiding. However, this was not a one-on-one battle between him and the second Palace Master. The other party had more than 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs. They were fully armed with swords and sabers. They could attack him at any time. At this moment he obviously did not want to reveal himself. After all, the second Palace Master could sense his tracks and aura, but the 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs were completely blind. They could not sense him at all. Seeing Ji Tianxing not only not reveal himself, but also continue moving to the left, the second Palace Master frowned and revealed a disdainful sneer. Brat, stop hiding. This old man has already discovered you and locked onto your aura. Today you will not be able to escape even if you have wings. Give up on your pointless struggle and obediently allow yourself to be captured. Follow me back to the divine hall. The second palace master looked down at Ji Tianxing with his hands behind his back. His words were filled with confidence and dominance. His loud voice spread thousands of miles, allowing the 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs to hear him clearly. However, when the desolate race godly monarchs heard this, they had different expressions. Many of them began to mutter in their hearts. They stared with their eyes wide open as they released their consciousness to search for traces of their target, but to no avail. Ignoring the young god emperor's traces, they could not even sense his aura. Yet the second palace master flew above the battleship and released his aura, suppressing the entire area. He was even domineering enough to force the young god emperor to appear. Many of the desolate race godly monarchs subconsciously believed him. They felt excited as well as a little nervous. They clenched their swords and sabers tightly as they silently accumulated their god power. They were prepared to attack the young god emperor at any time. However, a portion of the desolate race godly monarchs had other thoughts. They were wondering if the second palace master was bluffing. Perhaps the second palace master had not found any traces of the young god emperor, and only felt that he was nearby, so he wanted to trick the young god emperor into appearing? With this thought in mind, many of the desolate race godly monarchs found it very possible. After all, the second palace master had already taken such a stance. If he had really locked onto the young god emperor, that person would have appeared long ago. However, the surrounding sky remained silent. There was no abnormal movement at all. As such, the 1,000 desolate race godly monarchs clenched their respective divine weapons amidst their nervousness, excitement, agitation and suspicion, awaiting orders at any time. Seeing the reactions of the desolate race godly monarchs, Ji Tianxing was even more determined to not reveal himself easily. Hence, he turned a deaf ear to the second palace master's words and continued flying to the left. In just a few breaths' time he had flown a few hundred miles. He was about to fly out of the defensive line formed by the desolate race godly monarchs. However, the desolate race godly monarchs did not know of this. They were still looking ahead in a daze. The second palace master was enraged as he frowned. A cold beam flashed in his eyes as he bellowed angrily, "Kid, I have already given you a chance but you did not cherish it. Then don't blame me for being impolite." As his voice faded, the second palace master raised his palms and conjured vast and mighty god power. He controlled the heaven-earth god power and thousands of divine Tao laws as he used a divine ability. Heaven Quake Hammer. The second palace master bellowed as his hands instantly formed hundreds of divine seals, releasing this divine ability. Immediately, the god power in a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles gathered together, fusing with thousands of laws and Tao charms. It transformed into a gigantic hammer that was 100,000 feet long. It smashed down from the sky at Ji Tianxing. When the hammer came down, it brought with it a boundless suppressive force. It was as if the sky was collapsing as it suppressed Ji Tianxing. With him as the center, the space within 100 miles seemed to freeze, making it difficult for him to move. Chapter 45:13. Although the second palace master was the same as the fourth palace master, they were both at the middle realm of God Emperor. But there was a difference between the two. The second palace master was obviously stronger than the fourth palace master. From the moment the second palace master attacked, Ji Tianxing could tell that he had condensed at least 5 Tao rhymes. It was even possible that he had 6 Tao rhymes. If not, the mystic skill that the second palace master used would not have such terrifying power. Seeing the heaven-shaking hammer descending from the sky, Ji Tianxing had nowhere to hide and was about to be hit. At the critical moment he gritted his teeth and made up his mind. He was so close yet so far again. Although the surrounding space was almost sealed by the second palace master, Ji Tianxing still broke through the space barrier and successfully teleported out. However, he had expended more divine power and the distance he teleported was shorter. Phew! With a flash of divine light, Ji Tianxing disappeared from under the heaven-shaking hammer. In the next moment he traversed 80,000 miles of space and appeared above a lake in the east. The second palace master's sky-shaking hammer missed its target and smashed into the lofty mountain range with a loud noise that shook the heavens and earth. The mystic skill's destructive power was indeed shocking. It instantly destroyed a radius of 30,000 miles. The towering mountains and precipitous ridges were turned into ruins. Endless dust drifted in the air and the vast earth was trembling. Muffled loud noises reverberated in the sky. And in the center of the ruins where Xianxia was previously, the area with a radius of 10,000 feet was completely destroyed. Not only was the entire mountain reduced to nothingness, not even a speck of dust was left. Even the space was fragmented and could not be repaired in a short period of time. The area was left with terrifying divine power fluctuations and Tao rhymes. If anyone approached it, they would definitely be injured. Thousands of desolate race godly kings had seen the second palace master cast the mystic skill with their own eyes. Their hearts and expressions were filled with shock. However, everyone stared at the ruins in anticipation, but they did not see the scene they expected. There was no young god emperor covered in blood lying in the ruins, nor was there any blood stains or divine weapon fragments left behind by the young god emperor. There was nothing in the ruins, not a single trace. It was as if the young god emperor had never appeared and did not exist at all. This result made many of the desolate race godly kings mutter in their hearts. Previously, many people had guessed that the second palace master was bluffing. Now that they saw this scene, they were even more certain. Those desolate race godly monarchs who had confidence and expectations for the second palace master also began to consider and doubt him. However, the second hall master could not care less about what they were thinking. He could clearly sense that Xianxia had used the spatial shift ability and escaped at the last moment. The second palace master was filled with shock and disbelief. The fourth palace master had said before that the young god emperor was in the initial realm and had only condensed one Taoist rhyme. The second palace master thought that since he had condensed 6 Taoist rhymes, it would be easy for him to deal with the young god emperor. But he never would have thought that the young god emperor's methods would be so astonishing that he would be able to escape right under his nose. Good lad. Just like what the fourth palace master said, his aptitude is monstrous and his talent is extraordinary. He cannot be underestimated. This thought flashed through the second palace master's mind as he finally believed the fourth palace master's words. In the past, he, the third palace master and the fifth palace master had always believed that the fourth palace master was careless and incompetent, allowing the young god emperor to escape. In order to lessen his guilt and preserve his reputation, the fourth palace master had deliberately exaggerating the young god emperor. And now the second palace master had personally exchanged blows with Xianxia. Only then did he know that the fourth palace master's words were true. Time was of the essence, so the second palace master did not have time to think. He hurriedly released his perception to envelop a radius of 200,000 miles, searching for Xianxia's traces. Indeed, using a mystic technique, he quickly locked onto Xianxia's location. He was 80,000 miles to the east. Chase to the east, full speed. After confirming Xianxia's location, the second palace master decisively gave the order to pursue him. Just as his voice faded, he had already used teleportation and disappeared from his original spot, traversing 30,000 miles of space to chase to the east. Seeing the second palace master take the lead to chase with an anxious and urgent attitude, many of the desolate race godly kings were dumbfounded. Everyone was bewildered. Many of them were thinking that the second palace master's acting was too realistic. Could it be that after bluffing he was afraid that he would be seen through and lose face, so he could only continue with the act? That was highly possible. But regardless of whether it was true or not, since the second palace master had given the order, many of the desolate race godly kings could only follow his orders. Swish, swish, swish. More than 1,000 people hurriedly turned around and chased to the east at their fastest speed. They were like colorful rainbows that streaked across the sky. Xianxia used his ultimate move so close, yet worlds apart. After teleporting 80,000 miles, he stopped above the vast lake. Using this ultimate move twice in a short period of time still had side effects and backlash. It made him dizzy and his divine power chaotic. However, compared to before, the symptoms were much milder. It did not affect him as much. He silently circulated his energy and used a few seconds to suppress the chaotic divine power. Then he continued flying to the east. Of course, there were desolate race godly kings rushing over from all directions. He had to maintain his invisible state while escaping and hide his aura. He had to maintain his control so that he could only be discovered by the second palace master. He could not be detected by the desolate race godly kings. Phew! Ji Tianxing streaked across the sky like a bolt of lightning heading straight to the east. 80,000 miles behind him, the second palace master was like a beam of light streaking across the sky. He was chasing after him at lightning speed. With every passing second, the distance between the two of them was closing. The second palace master was stronger than the fourth palace master, and his speed was also faster. Even though Ji Tianxing had just increased his cultivation realm and his strength had increased greatly, he was still inferior to the second palace master. The two of them chased high in the sky for 30 seconds before the second palace master caught up to Ji Tianxing and cast a spell to strike him. Primordial Sacred Light. The second palace master clasped his hands together and divine light surged out from his body. He gathered the divine power of heaven and earth and infused it with the heavenly ways suppression. He blasted a huge beam of light at Ji Tianxing. The beam of light was 100 miles long and was colorful. Carried with it an endless amount of heavenly ways suppression as it came crashing down on Ji Tianxing. Although the terrifying heavenly ways suppression did not have much effect on Ji Tianxing, it was difficult to suppress him and weaken his strength. However, ignoring the divine heavenly ways suppression, the second palace master's divine power still had terrifying power. Ji Tianxing could only stop running and use all his strength to cast a spell to block it. Infinite Sky of Chaos. He roared angrily and used all his divine power of heaven and earth to infuse it with the heavenly ways power. He used the heaven and earth to form a colorful light shield to protect himself. The divine powers and secret techniques that the two of them used were of the same nature and composition. The only difference was that one of them had a higher cultivation realm and a deeper foundation of strength while the other was weaker. Kaboom! In the next moment, the divine beam of light that came crashing down from the sky hit the colorful light shield and engulfed Ji Tianxing's figure. An earth-shattering sound exploded between heaven and earth and shook 100,000 miles. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.